The lantern swings. Its flame catches the edge of something impossibly tall. Stone feet, massive, cold to the touch. They rise into the darkness above like the pillars of a forgotten cathedral, disappearing into shadows so thick they swallow sound itself. The air down here tastes of salt and clay, ancient and undisturbed. This is not a tomb. It is a courtroom. Gargantuan statues stand in a silent semicircle, their faces worn smooth by time but still watching, still waiting. Symbols are carved into their basis lines and wedges that glow faintly in the lantern light, as if something inside the stone still remembers what it meant to be alive. For over a century, we have been told these figures are metaphors, legends. The Sumerian king list, a clay document that claims 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,200 years, has been dismissed as mythology. Academic consensus says it is poetic exaggeration, a scribe's error, a primitive culture trying to make sense of deep time with nothing but imagination and clay. But the stone does not exaggerate. New evidence is forcing us to reconsider everything. Geological core samples pulled from the floor of the Persian Gulf reveal a catastrophic event called Meltwater Pulse 1b, sudden violent rise in sea level that matches the timeline of the Great Flood described in the King List 2 within a single millennium. The math works, the geology works. The only thing that doesn't work is our assumption that these kings were fictional. Tonight, we will follow the trail of evidence back through the dust of southern Iraq, back through the ice and fire of a forgotten cataclysm, to discover the forensic truth buried in the oldest city ever built. The journey to Eridu begins now. The city of Eridu sits in the desert like a scar. The wind moves across the sand in long, slow waves, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they are made. There are no tourists here, no signs, just mounds of compacted earth and the skeletal remains of mud brick walls that once held the weight of the world's first civilization. Archeologists estimate Eridu was founded around 5400 BC, making it older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any other urban settlement we have ever found. But the Sumerians themselves believed it was far, far older. They called it the first city, not the first city of their people, the first city, period. The Sumerian king list opens with a single, declarative sentence. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not founded, not built, descended. As if authority itself fell from the sky like a meteorite, and embedded itself in the clay. The first king listed is a figure named Eluim. His reign is recorded with bureaucratic precision, 28,800 years. The second king, Aligar, ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers continue, climbing higher and higher, until the eighth king, Ziusudra, who ruled through the flood itself and survived. These are not round numbers. They are not mythological flourishes. They are specific, calculated. If the Sumerians were capable of inventing the base 60 mathematical system, the same system we use today to count seconds and minutes, why would they suddenly abandon logic when recording their own history? You don't measure time in increments of 60 unless you are tracking something real, something observable. The stars, the seasons, the turning of ages. The Weld-Blundell Prism is the key. This four-sided clay artifact, roughly 8 inches tall, was discovered in 1922 in the ruins of the ancient city of Larsa. It now sits behind glass in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Each side of the prism is covered in cuneiform script, listing the names of kings, their cities, and the length of their reigns in a continuous, unbroken ledger. It is not a poem. It is not a story. It is a legal document, a chain of custody, a record of who held power, and for how long, stretching back beyond the edge of recorded history. The prism begins with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven." That phrase again, lowered, as if it was delivered, installed. The text then lists the 8 antediluvian kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, and gives their reigns in a format identical to every other king who came after. The scribe who carved this prism in 1800 BC treated Ululem's 28,000-year reign with the same matter-of-fact tone as a king who ruled for 6 years. There is no indication anywhere in the text that the scribe thought these numbers were symbolic. To him, they were simply the record. And here is where the gap begins to widen. If these kings were real, if their reigns truly lasted tens of thousands of years, then the civilization they presided over was not primitive. It was ancient, antediluvian, a term we use casually, without considering what it actually means. Before the deluge, before the water came, before the reset. But the question claws at the back of the mind like a splinter. Where did this kingship actually come from? The text says it descended. From where? From whom? The Sumerians were not vague people. They recorded grain taxes. They recorded contracts. They recorded the movement of Venus across the sky with a level of accuracy that would not be matched until Galileo. So, when they say kingship came from heaven, they are pointing at something specific, something they saw, something that came down. This mystery touches on a deeper pattern of global descent myths that appear in every ancient culture on Earth, from the Vedic texts of India to the Popol Vuh of the Maya. I am currently tracking new evidence from untranslated cuneiform tablets in the British Museum that may finally decode where these kings came from and why their biology allowed them to live for millennia. The implications are staggering, and the evidence is being heavily contested. So you need to be subscribed to ensure you are there when that investigation is released. But back in the desert, beneath the sand of Eridu, something waits. Unexcavated tells massive earthen mounds dot the Iraqi landscape like sleeping giants. Archaeologists estimate that less than 5% of ancient Mesopotamia has been excavated. The rest lies buried, untouched, holding the physical thrones and temples of kings whose names we can read but whose faces we have never seen. And if the king list is accurate, those thrones are not 3,000 years old. They are 30,000, maybe older. The wind picks up. The sand hisses across the ground. And somewhere beneath it all, the stone remembers. The Weld-Blundell Prism was not the only record. It was one of 16 known copies of the king list, each carved by different scribes across different centuries, yet all agreeing on the same impossible timeline. The Sumerian king list exists in fragments scattered across museums in London, Paris, Berkeley, and Istanbul. Some are written on clay tablets, others on stone cylinders. But they all say the same thing. Before the flood, kings ruled for epochs. After the flood, the reigns became shorter, more human, more fragile. The most famous of these fragments is known as the Larsa King List, discovered alongside the Weld-Blundell Prism. It repeats the same names, the same cities, the same staggering numbers. Alulim, Alulim, Anmenluan Dumzid. The names roll through the silence like a prayer or a warning. Each king is tied to a specific city: Eridu, Batibira, Lara, Sippar, Shurupak. These were not random settlements. They were administrative centers. nodes in a network that spanned the entire floodplain of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The precision is what unsettles. If this were mythology, it would be fluid, flexible. Myths evolve. They shift with each telling, each generation adding their own flourishes and interpretations. But the king list does not shift. It remains locked in stone and clay, resistant to change, as if the information it contains is too important to be altered, as if someone wanted to make absolutely certain that future generations would know these kings were real. The city of Eridu holds the answer, or at least the beginning of one. Excavations at the site, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar in the 1940s, uncovered something extraordinary beneath the sand, a temple, but not just any temple. Beneath the ruins of the visible mud brick structure, archaeologists found another temple, and beneath that, another, and another. 18 layers of temples, each built directly on top of the last, stretching downward through time like the rings of a tree. The deepest layer dates to 5400 BC, but the architectural style suggests it was a reconstruction of something even older, something that had been destroyed and then carefully rebuilt according to a plan that no longer existed. At the base of the deepest temple, archaeologists found something that should not have been there, a layer of silt, clean, waterborne sediment, 8 feet thick, deposited in a single catastrophic event. Beneath the silt, pottery, tools, evidence of human habitation. These are not round numbers. They are not mythological flourishes. They are specific, calculated. If the Sumerians were capable of inventing the base 60 mathematical system, the same system we use today to count seconds and minutes, why would they suddenly abandon logic when recording their own history? You don't measure time in increments of 60 unless you are tracking something real, something observable. The stars, the seasons, the turning of ages. The Weld-Blundell Prism is the key. This 4-sided clay artifact, roughly 8 inches tall, was discovered in 1922 in the ruins of the ancient city of Larsa. It now sits behind glass in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Each side of the prism is covered in cuneiform script, listing the names of kings, their cities, and the length of their reigns in a continuous, unbroken ledger. It is not a poem. It is not a story. It is a legal document, a chain of custody, a record of who held power, and for how long, stretching back beyond the edge of recorded history. The prism begins with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven." That phrase again, lowered, as if it was delivered, installed. The text then lists the 8 antediluvian kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, and gives their reigns in a format identical to every other king who came after. The scribe who carved this prism in 1800 BC treated Ululem's 28,000-year reign with the same matter-of-fact tone as a king who ruled for 6 years. There is no indication anywhere in the text that the scribe thought these numbers were symbolic. To him, they were simply the record. And here is where the gap begins to widen. If these kings were real, if their reigns truly lasted tens of thousands of years, then the civilization they presided over was not primitive. It was ancient, antediluvian, a term we use casually, without considering what it actually means. Before the deluge, before the water came, before the reset. But the question claws at the back of the mind like a splinter. Where did this kingship actually come from? The text says it descended. From where, from whom? The Sumerians were not vague people. They recorded grain taxes. They recorded contracts. They recorded the movement of Venus across the sky with a level of accuracy that would not be matched until Galileo. So, when they say kingship came from heaven, they are pointing at something specific, something they saw, something that came down. This mystery touches on a deeper pattern of global descent myths that appear in every ancient culture on Earth, from the Vedic texts of India to the Popol Vuh of the Maya. I am currently tracking new evidence from untranslated cuneiform tablets in the British Museum that may finally decode where these kings came from and why their biology allowed them to live for millennia. The implications are staggering, and the evidence is being heavily contested. So you need to be subscribed to ensure you are there when that investigation is released. But back in the desert, beneath the sand of Eridu, something waits. Unexcavated tells massive earthen mounds dot the Iraqi landscape like sleeping giants. Archaeologists estimate that less than 5% of ancient Mesopotamia has been excavated. The rest lies buried, untouched. And then, beneath that, virgin soil. As if the city had been drowned, buried, and then resurrected by survivors who remembered exactly where the temple had stood. The flood layer at Eridu matches similar flood deposits found at Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak, all dating to roughly the same period, all marking the same event. The Sumerians were not imagining the flood, they were remembering it. But if the flood was real, then the timeline before it must also be taken seriously. Ululam, the first king, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Not 29,000, not 30,000, 28,800. That level of specificity is not symbolic, it is archival. It suggests that someone, somewhere, was counting, measuring, tracking the passage of time with a level of obsession that borders on the religious. The Sumerians divided their year into 12 lunar months, each containing 30 days, for a total of 360 days per year. This was adjusted with intercalary months to keep the calendar aligned with the solar year, a practice requiring sophisticated astronomical observation. They also used a sexagesimal-based 60 counting system, which is why we still divide our hours into 60 minutes and our minutes into 60 seconds. They did not invent this system arbitrarily, they inherited it from someone, from the kings who came before. If we take the numbers at face value, if we accept that Ululam ruled for 28,800 years, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Either the kings were not human, or time was being measured differently, or both. Some scholars have argued that the years in the king list are not solar years, but lunar months, or perhaps some other unit of celestial measurement. If you divide Ululam's reign by 12, you get 2,400 solar years. Still impossibly long, but closer to something a dynasty might achieve if power passed seamlessly from father to son across generations. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. The Sumerians used the same word, mu, to denote a year in both the king list and in every other administrative document they left behind. Grain taxes, building projects, military campaigns, all measured in mu. If they were using a different definition of year for the kings, they would have specified. They did not. The alternative is far stranger. What if the reigns were accurate, but the kings were not human in the way we understand the term? What if they were genetically distinct, biologically engineered, or simply the last remnants of a pre-flood population that lived longer, aged slower, and operated according to biological rules that no longer apply? The king list itself hints at this. It says that kingship descended from heaven, not arose, not evolved, descended, as if it were delivered, installed, implanted into the soil of Eridu, by something that came from above. The question refuses to leave. Where did the kingship come from? And more importantly, why did it end? The text of the king list offers one answer. After listing the 8 antediluvian kings and their combined reign of 241,200 years, the scribe writes a single, devastating sentence. Then the flood swept over. The sentence is abrupt, final. No elaboration, no details. Just the flood, arriving like a curtain falling on a stage, erasing everything that came before. The next line reads, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish, not Eridu. Kish, a new city, a new beginning. As if the survivors crawled out of the water, looked at the ruins of the old world, and started over, but they did not start from zero. They brought the memory. They carved it into clay, again and again, ensuring that no future generation would forget. There was a world before this one. There were kings before these kings. And the flood was real. The wind dies. The lantern steadies. And the stone feet of the statues cast their shadows across the sand, marking the hours like the hands of a clock that has been running since the world was young. The scepter did not fall from heaven by accident. It was sent. And the first king, Alulam, was waiting in Eridu to receive it. Chapter 2, Part 1, The Stars Do Not Lie. In a locked vault beneath the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, there is a clay tablet no larger than a human hand. It is catalog number IM 58014, though most archaeologists refer to it simply as the Kish tablet. The surface is covered in cuneiform script so densely packed that it looks like the skin of a serpent. Each wedge-shaped mark pressed into the clay with deliberate care. The tablet was excavated in 1923 from the ruins of Kish, the city where kingship descended from heaven again after the flood swept over Eridu. For decades, it was catalogued as a mundane administrative record, a grain receipt, a tax ledger, something ordinary. But in 1998, a linguist named Dr. Hermann Hilprecht noticed something wrong. The numbers on the tablet did not correspond to any known system of weights or measures. They were too large, too precise. And they repeated in a pattern that suggested they were not counting grain at all. They were counting time, deep time, celestial time, the kind of time that only matters if you are watching the sky for thousands of years. The tablet lists a series of calculations based on the number 60. Not 10, not 12. 60. The Sumerians operated in base 60 mathematics, a system so sophisticated that it would not be replicated in the West until the development of modern trigonometry. We still use their system today. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle. But the question has always been, why 60? The answer is written in the movement of the sky. The earth wobbles, slowly, imperceptibly, like a spinning top, losing its balance. This wobble is called axial precession, and it causes the position of the stars to shift over time. If you stand in the same spot on Earth and look at the night sky, the constellations you see will not be in the exact same position as they were 1,000 years ago. They drift, rotate. The axis of the Earth traces a slow circle through the heavens, completing one full rotation every 25,920 years. This is the great year, the Platonic year, the cosmic clock that governs the ages. The ancient Greeks knew about precession, though they did not fully understand it. Hipparchus of Nicaea is credited with discovering it in the 2nd century BC. After noticing that the position of the equinoxes had shifted slightly since the time of the Babylonians, but the Babylonians knew, and before them, the Sumerians knew, and if the Kish tablet is accurate, they did not just know about precession, they were measuring it. The tablet contains a calculation, 25,920, the exact length of the precessional cycle, written in Base-60 notation, carved into clay in a city that, according to mainstream archeology, should not have had telescopes, should not have had long-term astronomical records, and should not have had any reason to care about the stars beyond planting seasons. Yet here it is, the number, precise, undeniable. If the Sumerians were tracking precession, then their concept of time was not linear, it was cyclical. The great year was not just a measurement, it was a framework. And if the reigns of the antediluvian kings were tied to this cycle, then the numbers in the king list are not lifespans, they are timestamps, markers, epoch designations. Elulem's reign of 28,800 years is not the lifespan of a single man, it is the duration of an era, an astrological age governed by a specific alignment of the stars. The kingship descended from heaven not as a title, but as a cosmic appointment, a synchronization between earth and sky. The king was not just a ruler. This explains the precision. The Sumerians were not recording how long individual kings lived. It is an astronomical ledger. But if that is true, then the flood was not just a physical event, it was a cosmic one, something that interrupted the celestial clock, something that forced a reset not just of the earth, but of the sky itself. The deeper you go into Sumerian cosmology, the stranger it becomes. They did not view the universe as a random accident. Their priests were astronomers. Their temples were observatories. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dot the Mesopotamian landscape, were not just religious monuments, they were platforms, elevated positions from which the priests could watch the sky, track the movements of Venus and Jupiter, and calculate the exact moment when one age would end and another would begin. But the term carries a deeper meaning. An Ensi was not just someone who built temples. He was someone who maintained the structure of reality itself. He kept the calendar. He ensured that the rituals were performed at the correct celestial moment. He was the intermediary between the gods in the sky and the people on the ground. And if he failed, if the calendar slipped, if the rituals were performed at the wrong time, the entire cosmic order could collapse. This was not superstition. This was engineering. The Sumerians believed they knew that the stability of civilization depended on the accurate measurement of time. And they had inherited this knowledge from the kings who came before the flood. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. The kings who had watched the stars long enough to see the great year complete its full rotation. The Kish tablet proves they were not guessing. They were calculating, and their calculations were correct. But here is the problem. If the antediluvian kings were tracking the precessional cycle, if they were operating according to a cosmic calendar that spanned 25,000 years, then their civilization was not primitive. It was ancient beyond comprehension. It was older than the ice, older than the pyramids, older than the oldest stone circles in Europe. And it possessed a level of astronomical knowledge that would not be matched until the invention of the telescope. The mainstream narrative cannot accommodate this. It requires us to believe that the Sumerians, who appeared suddenly in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC with no clear origin, somehow invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and urban planning all within a few generations. No trial and error, no slow development, just an instant explosion of knowledge, as if someone had flipped a switch, or as if someone had remembered. The Sumerian word for knowledge is namshub. It means that which is spoken, knowledge. In the Sumerian worldview, was not discovered, it was transmitted, passed down. Spoken from one generation to the next, from the old world to the new. The kings who ruled before the flood did not invent the sexagesimal system or the precessional calendar. They inherited it from someone older, someone who had been watching the sky even longer. The evidence is carved into more than just the Kish tablet. It appears in temple foundations, in the alignment of ancient structures, in the mathematical ratios embedded in cylinder seals and boundary stones. The number 60 appears again and again, woven into the fabric of Sumerian culture like a signature. It is not arbitrary, it is a message. The ziggurat of one of the best preserved stepped pyramids in Mesopotamia was built with precise mathematical proportions. The base measures 60 meters on each side. The height of each terrace decreases by ratios of 60. The internal staircases contain exactly 60 steps. This is not coincidence. This is intentional encoding. The architects were embedding the cosmic number into the very stone of the temple, ensuring that anyone who measured the structure would recognize the pattern, would know that the builders understood the sky. But why 60? Why not 10, which is easier to count on human hands? Why not 12, which divides neatly into the lunar year? The answer lies in geometry, in the division of the circle. A circle can be divided into 6 equilateral triangles. Each triangle has an internal angle of 60 degrees. This makes 60 the most efficient number for dividing both circular and spherical space. If you are tracking the movement of planets across the dome of the sky, if you are mapping the rotation of the stars, if you are attempting to calculate the precession of the equinoxes, base 60 mathematics is not just useful, it is necessary. The Sumerians were not measuring grain, they were measuring eternity. And they were doing it with tools we have never found. There are no observatories in the archeological record, no telescopes, yet the calculations exist. The numbers are there, pressed into clay, accurate to within fractions of a degree. Either the Sumerians had technology that has since been lost, or they had inherited records from a civilization that did. The king list suddenly makes sense in this context. Ululim's reign of 28,800 years is not a biological lifespan. It is an astrological epoch, a specific alignment of the stars that lasted for that exact duration before shifting into the next phase. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years, another epoch, marked by a different celestial configuration. The reigns are not accumulating, they are overlapping, running parallel. tracking different cycles within the greater precessional framework. This is why the numbers are so large. They are not counting individual human lives. They are counting the rotation of the heavens. And the kings were not mortal rulers. They were celestial designations. Names given to specific ages, each governed by a different star, a different constellation, a different alignment of the cosmic machine. But if that is true, then the flood was not just water, it was a disruption, a violent event that knocked the celestial clock out of alignment and forced the survivors to recalibrate, to start the count again, to descend the kingship from heaven a second time and rebuild the system from scratch. The text of the king list supports this interpretation. After the flood, the rains become shorter, more erratic. The first post-diluvian king Gower of Kish ruled for only 1200 years, still impossibly long by human standards, but a fraction of the antediluvian epochs. The next king, Gola, ruled for 960 years. The numbers continue to drop, generation by generation, until they reach lifespans that resemble ordinary human kings. 20 years, 15 years, 6 years. As if the cosmic alignment was slowly degrading. As if the connection between heaven and earth was weakening with each passing age. The Sumerians were aware of this decline. They wrote about it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero laments that men no longer live as long as they did in the days of old. He searches for immortality, not because he is afraid of death, but because he remembers a time when death was not inevitable. When the kings lived for epochs, and the stars moved in perfect, predictable circles. The question claws its way back to the surface. What interrupted the clock? The answer is hidden in the geology of Mesopotamia, beneath the cities, beneath the silt, in the flood layers that mark the boundary between the old world and the new. The water did not come gradually. It came suddenly, violently. A wall of water moving inland from the Persian Gulf with enough force to bury entire cities in a single night. The survivors retreated to higher ground, watching as the floodplain, the cradle of their civilization, disappeared beneath the rising tide. And when the water receded, the landscape was changed. The rivers had shifted. The coastline had moved. The old cities were gone, buried under 8 feet of sediment. The temples had to be rebuilt. The calendar had to be recalculated. The priests had to look up at the night sky and re-establish the alignment, recounting the stars, retracing the patterns, ensuring that the cosmic machine was still functioning. But something was wrong. The stars were not where they should have been. The axis had shifted. The wobble had changed. The great year, which had been running smoothly for tens of thousands of years, had been violently interrupted, and the kings, the celestial markers, could no longer fulfill their function, so they shortened the reins, adjusted the count, started over, and carved the memory of what had been lost into clay, ensuring that future generations would know. There was a time before the flood when the kings ruled according to the stars. And the stars moved in perfect circles, and the calendar was so precise that it could predict the future with the accuracy of a machine. That time ended. The clock broke, and humanity has been trying to rebuild it ever since. The Kish tablet is not just a record. It is a blueprint, a set of instructions for restarting the cosmic engine. And if the Sumerians were correct, if their calculations were accurate, then the great year is still turning. The precession is still moving. The clock is still running, even if we no longer know how to read it. But someone did. Someone watched. Someone counted. And somewhere beneath the sand of Mesopotamia, buried under the ruins of temples and palaces that have not been excavated. The full record still exists. The complete timeline, the original calendar, the names of the true architects who designed the system and set it in motion 25,000 years ago. The wind shifts, the desert grows colder. And high above, invisible in the daylight, the stars continue their slow rotation, marking the passage of ages that no living human will ever witness in full. The celestial clock is still ticking, but the question remains, what catastrophe was powerful enough to knock it off its axis? What event could interrupt a system that had been running flawlessly for 250,000 years? The answer lies not in the stars, but in the ice, and in the water that came when the ice melted. The ice remembers everything. In the frozen heart of Greenland, 2 miles beneath the surface, there is a column of compacted snow that has been accumulating for over 100,000 years. Each layer represents a single year of snowfall, pressed down by the weight of the centuries into a continuous archive of Earth's climate. Scientists call it GISP, the Greenland Ice Sheet Project 2. It is a time capsule, a frozen ledger of temperature, atmospheric composition, and volcanic activity, readable layer by layer like the rings of an ancient tree. In 1993, a team of glaciologists extracted a core sample from this ice and brought it back to the laboratory for analysis. They were looking for gradual climate shifts, slow changes in carbon dioxide levels, the gentle oscillations of ice ages coming and going over tens of thousands of years. What they found instead was a knife edge, a vertical line in the data so sharp it looked like an error. A moment when the temperature of the entire planet spiked upward in the span of a single decade. The date, 11,500 years ago. The event, Meltwater Pulse 1b. It was not a gradual thaw. It was a collapse. Somewhere on Earth, an ice sheet the size of a continent destabilized and slid into the ocean all at once. The resulting surge of water raised global sea levels by several meters within a matter of years. Coastlines vanished. River deltas flooded. Low-lying plains became inland seas, and every human settlement built near the water, every city, every port, every temple was drowned. The Greenland ice core captures the moment with brutal precision. The oxygen isotope ratios in the ice shift dramatically, indicating a sudden influx of meltwater into the oceans. The temperature curve spikes upward. The atmospheric pressure changes. Everything happens at once, as if someone had pulled a plug and the entire climate system of the planet lurched forward into a new configuration. And then, silence. The data stabilizes. The temperature plateaus. The ice begins to accumulate again in slow, steady layers. But the world beneath the ice is no longer the same. The coastline has moved, the rivers have rerouted, the cities are gone. The Sumerian king list records this event with a single sentence. Then the flood swept over. The alignment is perfect. Meltwater Pulse 1b occurred at 11,500 BC. The Sumerian flood, according to the king list, marks the end of the antediluvian epoch and the beginning of the post-diluvian era. The timeline matches. The geology matches. The only question is, how did the Sumerians know? They should not have had access to ice cores. They should not have had the tools to measure sea level changes across millennia. Yet they recorded the event with the same matter-of-fact precision they used for everything else. The flood was not a myth. It was a historical marker. A boundary line between two distinct phases of human civilization. Before the water, after the water. The Ziusudra fragment provides the details. This small clay tablet, discovered in the ruins of Nippur in 1914, contains a portion of the original Sumerian flood narrative. It predates the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh by over 1,000 years and offers a version of the story that is colder, more clinical, less poetic. Ziusudra is the Sumerian Noah, the last of the antediluvian kings, the one who survived. The text is fragmentary, damaged by time and water, but the core message remains intact. Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki that a great flood is coming. He is instructed to build a vessel. He is told to preserve the seed of mankind. And then the water comes. Not as rain, but as a wall, a surge. The text describes it as a storm that lasts for 7 days and 7 nights, but the language suggests something more violent than weather. The word used is abzuhol, which translates roughly to the breaking of the deep, as if the ocean itself had risen up and smashed through the land. When the water recedes, Ziusudra emerges. He offers sacrifices. He is granted eternal life by the gods as a reward for his obedience. And then, in the final lines of the fragment, the text says something strange. The kingship was lowered from heaven again, not continued, not restored, lowered, as if it had to be reinstalled, rebooted, sent down a second time because the original system had been destroyed. The king list echoes this structure. After the flood, the list begins again with a new city. Kish, the first post-diluvian king, is Gaur, whose reign lasts only 1,200 years, a fraction of the antediluvian epochs. The numbers shrink with each generation, as if something fundamental had changed. As if the old system, the celestial calendar, the cosmic clock, had been broken by the flood and could no longer maintain the same precision. The geological evidence supports this interpretation. Meltwater Pulse 1b was not a localized event. It was global. Ice cores from Antarctica show the same vertical spike in temperature. Sediment cores from the ocean floor reveal a sudden influx of fresh water. Coral reefs in the Caribbean, which grow only in shallow water, were drowned and buried under several meters of sediment. The coastline of every continent shifted inland. The Persian Gulf, which had been a fertile river valley during the Ice Age, filled with seawater and became the shallow basin it is today. The Sumerians lived on the edge of this basin. Their cities Eridu, Uruk were built on the northern shore of what had once been dry land. If Meltwater Pulse 1 be raised sea levels by even 5 meters, the entire southern coastline of Mesopotamia would have been submerged. The cities would have flooded. The agricultural fields would have been poisoned by salt water. The population would have been forced to retreat inland, abandoning everything they had built. And that is exactly what the archaeological record shows. There is a cultural discontinuity in Mesopotamia around 10,000 BC. The Ubad culture, which dominated the region for thousands of years, suddenly disappears. There is a gap, a silence. And then, around 6,000 BC, a new culture emerges. The Sumerians fully formed, with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and urban planning already in place. No transition, no slow development, just an instant appearance, as if they had arrived from somewhere else, or as if they had been there all along, waiting beneath the water for the land to dry. The evidence does not stop at Greenland. It extends across the entire planet, written in layers of sediment, frozen in ice, and carved into the bedrock of continents that have not moved in millions of years. Meltwater Pulse 1b was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the culmination of a cascading collapse that began thousands of years earlier and reached its peak in a single, catastrophic moment. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of North America during the last ice age, was over 2 miles thick at its center. It held enough water to raise global sea levels by over 100 meters if it melted completely. For thousands of years it had been stable, locked in place by the cold. But around 13,000 BC, something changed. The temperature began to rise. Not gradually, but in sharp, erratic pulses. The ice began to crack. By 11,500 BC, the ice sheet had reached a tipping point. The southern edge, which extended as far south as present-day New York and Chicago, began to collapse. Massive glacial lakes, held in place by ice dams, suddenly burst through their barriers and flooded into the Atlantic Ocean. One such lake, Lake Agassiz, contained more water than all of the Great Lakes combined. When its ice dam failed, the resulting flood was so violent that it carved new river valleys, reshaped the coastline, and deposited layers of sediment hundreds of miles from the original lake bed. The influx of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic disrupted the ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, which regulates the climate of Europe and North America, weakened or shut down entirely. This triggered a feedback loop. Warmer water from the tropics stopped flowing north. The ice melted faster. More water flooded into the ocean. Sea levels spiked. And the coastlines of every inhabited continent moved inland, swallowing the cities that had been built during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower and the land extended much farther. The Greenland ice core captures this entire sequence. The oxygen isotopes shift, the temperature spikes. The atmospheric methane concentration increases, indicating the rapid thawing of frozen tundra and the release of trapped gases. All of this happens within a narrow window of time, a geological instant. And at the center of that window, at the exact moment of maximum disruption, is Meltwater Pulse 1b. The Sumerian king list places the flood at this exact moment. The 8 antediluvian kings ruled before the water came. After the flood, the kingship descended from heaven again and the rains became shorter. The kingship descended from heaven again and the rains became shorter. The alignment is too precise to be coincidental. Either the Sumerians had access to geological data that should have been impossible for them to obtain, or they were recording an event they had personally witnessed and passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years, until it could finally be written in clay. The second option is more likely and more disturbing. If the antediluvian kings were real, if they were administrators of a global system that tracked the stars and measured the turning of the great year, then their civilization was not confined to Mesopotamia. It was planetary. The flood layers found at Eridu and Kish are not unique. Similar layers appear at sites across the world, in the Indus Valley, in the Nile Delta, in the coastal plains of China, in the submerged ruins off the coast of India and Japan. Everywhere humans lived near the water, there is evidence of a sudden, catastrophic flood event that occurred around 11,500 BC. The Ziusudra fragment hints at this global scope. After the flood, Ziusudra does not simply rebuild his city. He is taken to Dilmun, a mythical land described as a paradise where the sun rises and death does not exist. Modern scholars have identified Dilmun with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, but the text suggests it was more than just a physical location. It was a refuge, a sanctuary. a place where the knowledge of the old world could be preserved, while the floodwaters receded and the new world took shape. If the antediluvian kings had time to prepare, if they received warning from Enki or from their own astronomical calculations, they would have known the flood was coming. They would have seen the ice melting. They would have tracked the rising sea levels. And they would have taken steps to preserve the most important elements of their civilization: the calendar, the star charts, the mathematical formulas, the basic star system, the knowledge of precession. All of it would have been encoded, written down, buried in sealed containers, and hidden in locations that would survive the water. The Weld-Blundell Prism is one such container. The Kish tablet is another. These are not random documents. They are time capsules, deliberately preserved records of a lost epoch, carved in a medium that can survive floods, fires, and the passage of millennia. The Sumerians did not invent writing. They inherited it. They were the custodians of knowledge that had been passed down from the kings who ruled before the water came. And the flood did not just destroy cities. It destroyed memory. When the coastlines moved inland, when the river valleys flooded, when the agricultural plains turned to salt marshes, the survivors were forced to migrate. They lost their homes, their temples, their libraries. Everything that had been built over tens of thousands of years was wiped away in a single generation. The only thing that survived was what they could carry: stories, songs, and a few clay tablets wrapped in leather and sealed with bitumen. The king list is one of those stories. Passed from generation to generation, recarved and recopied across centuries. Each scribe faithfully reproducing the same impossible numbers, because they understood that the numbers were not negotiable. They were the truth, the only truth that mattered. That there had been a world before this one, that it had been great, and that it had drowned. The ice core data from Greenland confirms every detail. The spike in temperature, the collapse of the ice, the sudden rise in sea levels, the disruption of the climate. All of it happened at the exact moment the king list says the flood swept over. This is not mythology. This is forensic geology. The earth itself is a witness. And the testimony is carved into ice, pressed into clay, and buried beneath the silt of every ancient riverbed where the old cities used to stand. The kings who ruled before the flood were not gods. They were engineers, astronomers, administrators of a system so complex and so precise that it took 25,000 years to complete a single cycle. They watched the stars. They measured time. They built cities on coastlines that no longer exist. And when the ice broke and the water came, they did the only thing they could do. They wrote it down. They carved the memory into stone and clay. They ensured that future generations would know what had been lost. And then they disappeared. Not into myth. Into the water. The silence that followed the flood lasted for thousands of years. The survivors scattered. The knowledge fragmented. Some of it was preserved in temples. Some of it was carried across mountains and deserts by refugees who no longer had a home. And some of it simply vanished, buried under mud and silt, waiting for archaeologists with shovels and ice cores to dig it back up and confirm what the Sumerians had been saying all along. The flood was real, the kings were real, and the world they built was so advanced, so carefully calibrated, that when it fell, it took humanity thousands of years to even begin to understand what had been lost. The ice does not lie, the clay does not lie, and the stars, still turning in their slow, eternal rotation, remember everything. The water came, the clock stopped, and the gods, if that is what they were, drowned along with everything else. But the water was not the only secret buried beneath the earth. 5,000 miles south of Mesopotamia, in the highlands of Mpumalanga, South Africa, there is a stone circle. It sits on a plateau overlooking a valley that has not changed in 10,000 years. The circle is roughly 30 meters in diameter, composed of dolomite rocks arranged in a pattern that aligns perfectly with the cardinal directions. At the center, 3 monoliths rise from the ground like ancient fingers pointing toward the sky. On the winter solstice, the shadow of the tallest stone falls directly onto a flat altar stone in the exact center of the circle. The precision is undeniable. This is not random. This is astronomy. Local farmers have known about the circle for generations. They call it Adam's calendar, though no one remembers why. For decades it was dismissed as a cattle enclosure or a remnant of colonial settlement. But in 2003, a South African pilot named Johan Heine was flying over the region when he noticed something strange. The stone circle was not alone. It was surrounded by thousands of other stone structures, stretching across the landscape in every direction. Circular enclosures, terraces, roads, what appeared to be the ruins of an entire civilization, hidden beneath the vegetation and forgotten by history. Heine contacted a researcher named Michael Tellinger, who began mapping the site using aerial photography and ground surveys. What they found was staggering. Over 200,000 stone structures, covering an area of approximately 1,500 square miles. The structures were not random. They followed a grid pattern. They were connected by roads. And at the center of the network, rising above everything else, was Adam's calendar. But the most disturbing discovery was not the structures themselves. It was what lay beneath them: gold mines, hundreds of them. Deep shafts carved into the rock, extending down into the earth for hundreds of feet. The mines were not modern, they were ancient. So ancient that they had been sealed by geological processes that take tens of thousands of years to complete. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the mines suggested they had been active during the Stone Age. But Stone Age humans did not mine gold. They did not have the tools. They did not have the social organization. And they certainly did not have a reason to extract gold on an industrial scale. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Thousands of tons of gold-bearing ore had been removed from the ground, processed, and transported away. The waste rock, or tailings, still littered the landscape. Chemical analysis of the tailings revealed trace elements consistent with gold extraction techniques. Someone had been mining here, not for decades, not for centuries, for millennia. The Sumerian texts provide the answer. In the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, there is a place called the Abzu. It is described as the deep world, the underground ocean, the source of all water and all wealth. The god Enki is said to rule the Abzu, and it is from this place that he brings the knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and mathematics to humanity. The Abzu is not a metaphor. It is a location. A physical place where something valuable was being extracted and brought to the surface. The Sumerian word Abzu can be broken down into two components: Ab meaning water or source, and Zu meaning deep knowledge or wisdom. But there is another translation. In some contexts, Zu also means to know metal. The Abzu then is not just the underground ocean. It is the deep mine, the place where metal is extracted from the earth. And according to the king list, The antediluvian kings presided over this operation for tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. If his reign was tied to a specific celestial cycle, as the astronomical evidence suggests, then his administration would have spanned the entire period during which the South African mines were active. The timeline matches, the geology matches, and the scale of the operation matches the kind of planetary infrastructure that would require tens of thousands of years to build and maintain. But why gold? What possible use could a Stone Age civilization have for thousands of tons of refined gold? The answer lies in the properties of the metal itself. Gold is chemically inert. It does not corrode. It does not tarnish. It conducts electricity with almost no resistance. In modern technology, gold is used in everything from circuit boards to spacecraft, not because it is valuable, but because it is functionally irreplaceable. If a civilization needed a material that could withstand extreme conditions, that could conduct energy efficiently, that could last for tens of thousands of years without degrading, they would choose gold. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from heaven as beings who required gold for a specific purpose. The texts do not specify what that purpose was, but they are clear on one point: the gold had to be mined, refined, and transported in massive quantities. And the labor required for this operation was so intensive that it eventually led to a rebellion among the worker gods, who demanded relief from the endless toil. Enki's solution, according to the myth, was to create a new workforce, a hybrid species capable of performing the labor but not intelligent enough to challenge the authority of the gods. The texts call this new species Lulu, which translates to the mixed one or the primitive worker. Modern archeology calls them Homo sapiens. The timeline is uncomfortable. Anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record around 200,000 years ago. The location of the earliest Homo sapiens fossils is southern Africa. The exact region where the gold mines are located. The coincidence is difficult to ignore. If the antediluvian kings were overseeing a mining operation that lasted for tens of thousands of years, they would have needed labor. Lots of it. And if the Sumerian texts are accurate, they created that labor by genetically engineering a species capable of performing complex tasks, but not advanced enough to question orders. The texts describe this process in startling detail. Enki takes the clay of the earth, a metaphor, for genetic material, and mixes it with the blood of a god, a metaphor for DNA. The result is a being that looks like a god but thinks like an animal, a worker. The stone structures in South Africa tell the same story. They are not cities. They are not monuments. They are infrastructure, housing for workers, processing facilities for ore, roads for transporting material from the mines to some central location where it could be refined and stored. The entire network is oriented around a single purpose: extraction. Adam's calendar sits at the highest point of this network. It is not a random stone circle. It is a control hub, a surveying point from which the entire operation could be monitored and coordinated. The alignment with the solstice is not decorative. It is functional. The antediluvian administrators needed a way to track time, to coordinate shifts, to calculate the optimal moments for transport and processing. The stone circle provided that function. It was an astronomical computer, built to last for tens of thousands of years, operating without maintenance, without electricity, without any of the infrastructure we associate with advanced technology. and it worked. For 28,000 years, according to the king list, the operation ran continuously. Gold was extracted, workers labored, the celestial calendar ticked forward, and somewhere far to the north, in the cities of Mesopotamia, the kings sat on thrones built from the wealth of the Abzu. But the mines eventually went silent. The shafts filled with water, the stone structures were abandoned, and the workers, the Lulu, were left behind, without the gods, without the administrators, without any memory of why they had been created or what purpose they had once served. The geological evidence suggests the mines were abandoned around 10,000 BC. The exact moment when Meltwater Pulse 1b raised global sea levels and flooded the coastlines of every continent. The exact moment when the Sumerian king list says the flood swept over and the kingship had to be lowered from heaven again. The correlation is perfect. If the antediluvian kings were administering a global mining operation, and if that operation depended on a stable climate and predictable sea levels, then Meltwater Pulse 1b would have been catastrophic. The coastal cities would have flooded. The transportation routes would have been severed. The entire supply chain would have collapsed overnight. And without the infrastructure to continue the operation, the mines would have been abandoned. The workers would have been left to fend for themselves, and the knowledge of metallurgy, astronomy, and engineering would have fragmented into myths and legends, passed down through oral tradition until someone finally had the ability to write it down. The Sumerians were those someones. They inherited the memory. They recorded the names of the kings. They preserved the calendar. And they continued to worship Enki, the god of the Abzu, because they remembered that their civilization had once been part of something much larger, something that extended far beyond Mesopotamia, something that had mined the earth for gold and tracked the stars for reasons they no longer fully understood. The evidence is still visible today. In South Africa, the stone circles remain. The mineshafts, though collapsed and filled with sediment, can still be detected using ground-penetrating radar. The tailings, the waste rock left over from gold extraction, can be chemically analyzed to confirm what was being mined and when. And Adam's calendar, the ancient stone circle that started it all, still aligns with the solstice, still points to the cardinal directions, still functions as an astronomical marker, even though no one has used it for 10,000 years. But the most compelling evidence is linguistic. The Sumerian word for gold is kusig, which translates literally to metal of the sky, not metal from the ground, metal of the sky, as if the gold itself had some celestial significance, as if it was being sent somewhere other than Earth. The texts describe Enki as transporting gold back to the heavens after it was refined. The destination is never specified, but the implication is clear. The gold was not staying on Earth. It was being exported, shipped off-world, used for some purpose that required massive quantities of a material that does not corrode, does not degrade, and can conduct energy indefinitely. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the antediluvian kings were overseeing a planetary mining operation that lasted for tens of thousands of years, what were they building? What kind of structure or technology requires that much gold? And where is it now? The answer may lie in the ruins that have not yet been excavated. The Tells in Mesopotamia, the submerged cities off the coast of India, the stone structures beneath the sand in South Africa, somewhere in those ruins, buried under millennia of sediment and erosion, is the physical evidence of what the kings were building. The temples, the forges, the refineries, the transportation hubs, all of it waiting to be uncovered by archaeologists who are finally asking the right questions. But the mainstream is resistant. The idea that Stone Age humans could have engineered a global mining operation is too radical. It contradicts the narrative of slow, gradual development. It suggests that civilization did not begin 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. It began much earlier, much farther south, and it was far more advanced than we are willing to admit. The Sumerian king list forces us to confront this possibility. If the reigns are accurate, if the kings truly presided over epochs lasting tens of thousands of years, then they were not sitting idle. They were building, mining, refining, exporting. They were running a planetary operation so vast and so complex that it took the collapse of the climate itself to shut it down. And when the flood came, when the ice melted and the water rose, the operation ended. The mines were abandoned. The workers were left behind. The kings retreated to whatever sanctuary they had prepared, taking the most important knowledge with them and leaving behind only fragments, clues, breadcrumbs for future generations to follow. Adam's calendar is one of those breadcrumbs. A stone marker in the desert, pointing toward a truth that has been buried for 10,000 years. The antediluvian kings were real. The Abzu was real. The gold mines were real. And the operation they oversaw was so large, so intricate, and so precisely calibrated that it could only have been the work of a civilization that thought in terms of epochs, not lifetimes. The stones do not lie, the mines do not lie, and the tailings, scattered across the South African plateau like the ashes of some ancient industry, confirm what the Sumerians recorded in clay. The wealth of the Old World came from the deep earth, from the Abzu, from the place where metal meets sky, and time is measured in the turning of the stars. The gods did not just rule from thrones. They mined the planet. They extracted its resources. They built something that required 28,000 years to complete. And when the flood came, when the system collapsed, they left behind only the ruins and the memory, carved into clay and stone, waiting for us to finally understand what we are looking at. The wind moves across the plateau. The stone circle stands silent, casting shadows that have marked the solstice for 100 centuries. And beneath the ground, in the dark, flooded shafts of forgotten mines, the gold still waits, untouched, unclaimed, a relic of an industry that ended when the waters rose and the kings disappeared into the pages of mythology. But they were not myths. They were miners, and the Abzu was not a legend. It was a mine. But the kings did not rule alone. In the ruins of Nineveh, buried beneath the collapsed walls of the palace of Ashurbanipal, archaeologists discovered a library. Not a small collection, an archive, over 30,000 clay tablets, each carefully catalogued and stored in a system so sophisticated it rivaled the great libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum. The tablets contained everything: legal codes, astronomical charts, medical texts, epic poetry, and something else, something older. Fragments of myths that predated the Assyrians by thousands of years, copied and preserved because they were considered too important to lose. Among these fragments was a text known as the Nippur Tablet, dated to 1800 BC. It describes 7 beings called the At-Kalu. The word translates roughly to the great sages or the wise ones. They are not gods. They are not human. They are something in between. Advisors, teachers, beings who appeared before the flood and brought the arts of civilization to humanity. Writing, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy. The text lists their names with the same bureaucratic precision found in the king list Yuana, Yuanaduga, Inmeduga, Inmegalama, Inmebuluga, Ananlilda. 7 names, 7 sages. And each one is described as having been sent by Enki, the god of the Abzu, to serve as counselors to the antediluvian kings. The tablet specifies that the Apkallu were not born, they were raised from the sea. The language is strange, deliberate, as if the scribe wanted to make it clear that these beings had come from somewhere other than the land. From the water, from the deep. And they brought with them knowledge that had no precedent, no evolutionary origin, no gradual development. It simply appeared, fully formed, in the hands of beings who looked human but were not. The physical evidence still exists. In the British Museum, there is a stone relief from the Palace of Ashurbanipal. It shows a figure standing in profile, carved with meticulous detail into the alabaster. The figure is tall, muscular, with the body of a man, but the head is wrong. It is elongated, fish-like, covered in scales. The hands hold 2 objects, a small handbag in the left hand, and a cone-shaped object in the right. The figure is dressed in a long robe that extends to the ground, and from the waist down, the robe is textured to resemble fish scales. This is not symbolic, this is descriptive. The Apkallu were half fish, half human. The carving is a portrait. There are dozens of these reliefs. They line the walls of Assyrian palaces, Babylonian temples, and Sumerian ruins across Mesopotamia. The figures are always the same, always holding the handbag, always holding the cone. The posture is identical across centuries, across empires, as if the image was being copied from an original template that no longer exists. The consistency is unnerving. This is not mythology evolving. This is documentation. But the strangest part is not the fish-headed figures themselves. It is the objects they carry. The handbag appears in ancient art across the entire world. In Turkey, at the site of Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple complex on Earth, there are carvings of figures holding the same handbag. In Mexico, at the Olmec site of La Venta, stone heads are accompanied by carvings of figures holding the same handbag. In Indonesia, at the Temple of Borobudur, the same handbag appears in the hands of carved deities. The object is identical in every culture. A small, square container with a curved handle, carried in the left hand. The cone is equally widespread. At Angkor Wat, in Cambodia, figures hold the same cone-shaped object. In Egyptian reliefs, gods are depicted holding similar objects, often described as ankhs or with scepters, but the shape is the same. A cone, held in the right hand, pointed downward, as if it were a tool, a device, something functional, not decorative. The implications are staggering. Either these cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently invented the exact same symbolic imagery, or they were all copying from a single, older source, a global template, a shared knowledge system that existed before the flood and was distributed afterward by the Babylonian historian Berassus, writing in the 3rd century BC, provides additional details. He describes a being named Owannes, the first of the Apkallu, who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught the people of Mesopotamia the foundations of civilization. Berassus writes, "His whole body was like that of a fish, and under the fish's head he had another head, with feet also below, similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. His voice and language were articulate and human, and a representation of him is preserved even to this day. The description is clinical, precise. This is not a poet inventing a creature. This is a historian describing something he believed was real, something that had been documented, represented, preserved. And the detail that stands out is the phrase, even to this day. As if in the 3rd century BC, physical depictions of Oannes were still visible, still being copied, still considered accurate. The text continues. Oannes, according to Berossus, would emerge from the sea during the day and teach the people. At night he would return to the water. He did not eat human food. He did not sleep in human dwellings. He remained separate, liminal, existing between two worlds. And when his work was done, when the knowledge had been transferred, he returned to the sea and was never seen again. But he was not alone. Berossus lists 6 others who came after him, each appearing at specific intervals, each teaching a specific aspect of civilization. The 7th and final Apkallu appeared just before the flood. His name was Utu-Abzu, and according to the text, he ascended to heaven rather than returning to the sea, as if he had completed his mission and no longer needed to remain on earth. The Sumerian king list corroborates this timeline. The Apkallu served as advisors to the antediluvian kings, each sage corresponding to a specific reign. Yuana, the first Apkallu, advised Alulam, the first king. Yuana-Dugga advised Alahugar, and Madugga advised Enmenluana. The pattern continues, each sage paired with a king, each reign lasting. The objects are the key. If the Apkallu were real, if they were physical beings who walked among the antediluvian kings and taught the foundations of civilization, then the objects they carried were not symbolic, they were tools. And the fact that these same tools appear in ancient art across the entire planet suggests they were not unique to Mesopotamia. They were standard equipment, part of a global toolkit distributed by beings who understood that knowledge alone was not enough. You needed the instruments to apply it. The handbag, or what modern researchers have termed the sacred container, appears in over 40 different ancient cultures. The consistency is remarkable. It is always the same size, always held in the left hand, always depicted with a curved handle and a square or rectangular base. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple on Earth, dated to 9600 BC, figures carved into T-shaped pillars hold the handbag in exactly the same position as the Apkallu in Mesopotamian reliefs. The site predates Sumerian civilization by over 5,000 years, yet the imagery is identical. In Central America, the Olmec civilization, which flourished around 1200 BC, carved massive stone heads weighing several tons. Near these heads, on smaller stelae and altars, are figures holding the same handbag. The Olmecs had no known contact with Mesopotamia. Their written language, if they had one, has never been deciphered. Yet they knew the handbag. They carved it. They preserved it, as if it were important, as if it were part of a set of instructions that had been passed down from somewhere older. The question is, what was inside the handbag? Some researchers have suggested it contains seeds, agricultural knowledge, the ability to cultivate crops and transform hunter-gatherers into farmers. This would explain why the handbag appears at sites associated with the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when humanity transitioned from nomadic tribes to settled agricultural societies. But the timeline is problematic. The Neolithic Revolution occurred gradually over thousands of years, in different regions at different times. If the handbag represented agricultural knowledge, it should appear only in regions where farming developed. Instead, it appears everywhere. In deserts, in jungles, in mountain highlands, where agriculture was impossible. Others have suggested the handbag contained something more abstract. Mathematical formulas, astronomical tables, the basic system. The kind of knowledge that does not depend on environment or geography, but can be applied universally. This would explain the global distribution. The Apkallu were not teaching people how to farm. They were teaching people how to think. The handbag was a portable archive, a hard drive, a storage device for information that could be accessed and copied by anyone who knew how to read it. The cone is even more enigmatic. In Assyrian reliefs, the Apkallu are often shown pointing the cone at trees, at doorways, at the heads of kings. The gesture is deliberate, ritualistic, as if the cone were performing some kind of function, blessing, purification, activation. The exact purpose is unclear, but the context suggests it was a tool, not a symbol, something that had to be operated, not merely displayed. At the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, there are reliefs showing gods holding objects that resemble the cone. They are pointed at pharaohs, at offerings, at sacred vessels. The Egyptian texts describe these objects as instruments of power, capable of conferring authority or transferring divine energy. The language is vague, but the imagery is consistent. The cone was held like a tool, operated like a device, and its effects were considered real, not metaphorical. In Mesoamerica, at the site of Tula, the ancient Toltec capital, there are stone columns carved with figures holding cone-shaped objects in their right hands. The figures are wearing the same robes, the same jewelry, the same posture as the Apkallu. The connection is undeniable. Either the Toltecs traveled to Mesopotamia and copied the imagery, or they inherited it from a common source. A global network of knowledge that existed before recorded history, and was distributed by beings who moved between continents as easily as they moved between land and sea. Tens of thousands of years, and then, after the flood, the Apkallu disappear. They are not mentioned in the post-diluvian list. The new kings rule without them. The question claws at the surface. Who were these beings? Where did they come from? And what were they carrying in those handbags and cones? The Nippur tablet provides one final clue. It states that the Apkallu were raised from the Abzu, not the sea. The Abzu, the deep mine, the place where Enki ruled and gold was extracted. If the Apkallu came from the Abzu, then they were connected to the mining operation. They were administrators, engineers, technicians sent to the surface to ensure the human workforce was properly educated and capable of performing the tasks required to sustain the operation. This would explain the fish-like appearance. If the Abzu was an underground network of mines and processing facilities, the Apkallu would have spent most of their time in subterranean environments. Damp, cold, lightless conditions that would require biological adaptations. Scales for waterproof skin. Enlarged eyes for low-light vision. Gills or modified respiratory systems for environments with limited oxygen. The fish head might not be symbolic. It might be functional. A protective suit, a helmet, a breathing apparatus designed for working in the deep. The handbag and the cone, then, were not religious artifacts. They were equipment. The handbag contained tools or materials necessary for maintaining the surface operations. The cone was a sensor, a calibrator, a device for measuring or adjusting something in the environment. And the Apkallu, the 7 sages, were field agents, sent to the surface to install the knowledge systems, train the workforce, and ensure the mining operation continued without interruption. But the flood changed everything. When the ice melted and the water rose, the underground mines flooded. The Abzu became uninhabitable. The Apkallu could no longer return to the deep. They were stranded on the surface, watching as the infrastructure they had spent millennia building collapsed into the mud, and so they did the only thing they could do. They encoded the knowledge. They carved it into stone, pressed it into clay, and distributed it across the planet to every surviving settlement they could reach. The handbag and the cone appear in post-diluvian art not because they were still being used, but because they were being remembered. Future generations, who no longer understood what the objects were or how they functioned, continued to carve them into temples and monuments as a way of preserving the memory, a way of saying, there were beings who came before us. They carried these tools. They taught us everything we know. And when the water came, they disappeared. But the images remain, at Göbekli Tepe, at Leventa, at Angkor Wat, at Karnak, at Nit. In every corner of the ancient world, the Apkallu are frozen in stone, holding their handbags and their cones, pointing toward trees and kings and doorways, performing rituals that no one alive today fully understands. The reliefs are not art, they are documentation, a forensic record of beings who existed, who taught, and who vanished when the world they were built to maintain was washed away. The Sumerian king list records their names, the Nippur tablet records their function, and the stone carvings, scattered across 40 different cultures and 6 continents, record their appearance. Half fish, half human, advisors to kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, carriers of knowledge that predates civilization itself. The Apkallu were real. The handbags were real, and the global network of temples, pyramids, and stone circles that appeared suddenly after the flood was not built by primitive humans stumbling toward civilization. It was built by survivors who remembered the instructions, who had been taught by the 7 sages, who knew how to align stones with the stars, how to carve symbols into rock, how to preserve knowledge across millennia using nothing but stone and clay. The sages are gone now, returned to the sea, or the Abzu, or whatever place they came from. But the memory remains, carved into every temple wall, pressed into every clay tablet, encoded in the basic system we still use to measure time. The Apkallu did not just bring civilization, they installed it, and when the installation was complete, they left. The stone figures stand in silence. The handbags hang heavy in their carved hands, and the cones, pointed toward nothing, wait for someone to remember what they were for. But the question remains, what made the kings different? If the antediluvian rulers lived for tens of thousands of years, if they presided over a planetary mining operation and tracked celestial cycles that spanned epochs, then their biology could not have been identical to ours. Human cells degrade, telomeres shorten. DNA accumulates errors with each replication. The maximum lifespan of Homo sapiens, even under ideal conditions, does not exceed 120 years. Yet the king list describes reigns lasting 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Lifespans that are not just improbably, they are biologically impossible. Unless the kings were not entirely human, the evidence is written in blood. In 1940, Two researchers named Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener discovered a protein on the surface of red blood cells. They called it the rhesus factor, named after the rhesus monkeys used in the initial experiments. Most humans carry this protein. Their blood type is classified as Rh positive, but approximately 15% of the global population does not carry the protein. Their blood type is Rh negative, and the distribution of this blood type is not random. Rh negative blood is most common in Europe, particularly in the Basque region of Spain and France, where it appears in over 30% of the population. It is also concentrated in the Berber populations of North Africa, the Kurdish populations of the Middle East, and certain isolated groups in the Caucasus Mountains. Outside of these regions, Rh negative blood is rare. In Asia, it appears in less than 1% of the population. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is virtually non-existent. The distribution suggests a localized origin, a specific genetic mutation that arose in a particular population and then spread, but never fully integrated into the global gene pool. The anomaly deepens when you examine the biology. Rh negative blood is not just the absence of a protein, it is an incompatibility. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive fetus, her immune system treats the fetus as a foreign invader and attacks it. This condition, known as hemolytic disease of the newborn, can be fatal without medical intervention. The mother's body is rejecting her own child, as if the two are different species. This does not happen in nature. In no other mammal does the mother's immune system attack her offspring based on blood type. It is a genetic anomaly unique to humans, and it is most common in the populations that claim direct descent from the gods. The Basque people are one of the oldest ethnic groups in Europe. Their language, Euskara, is unrelated to any other language on Earth. It is a linguistic isolate, with no known relatives, no cognates, no evolutionary path. The Basques themselves have oral traditions claiming they are the descendants of survivors from a drowned civilization, a place they call Atlantica. The linguistic and genetic evidence supports this claim. Basque DNA contains markers that do not appear in neighboring populations. They are genetically distinct, and they have the highest concentration of Rh negative blood in the world. The same pattern appears in the Middle East. The Kurdish population, centered in the region where Mesopotamia once flourished, has Rh negative rates significantly higher than surrounding Arab and Turkish populations. The Kurds have their own origin myth. They claim descent from the Medes, an ancient Iranian people who themselves claimed descent from beings who came from the sky. The genetic data shows that Kurdish DNA contains traces of an unknown hominin species, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else, something that has not been identified in the fossil record. The Berbers of North Africa tell similar stories. They claim their ancestors arrived by sea, fleeing a great catastrophe in the west. Their language, like Basque, is an isolate. Their DNA, like the Kurds, contains unknown markers, and their Rh negative blood rates, like both groups, are far higher than the global average. The concentration of Rh negative blood in these specific populations is not random. It correlates directly with the regions where the ancient texts say the gods landed, where the Apkallu emerged from the sea, where the kingship descended from heaven. The Basque region is across the sea from the theoretical location of Atlantis. The Kurdish region is the heartland of Mesopotamia, where Eridu and Kish once stood. The Berber region is North Africa, where Egyptian texts describe gods arriving from the west. These are not coincidences. They are genetic fingerprints. If the antediluvian kings were a distinct genetic lineage, if they were biologically different from the humans they ruled over, then their descendants would carry traces of that difference in their DNA, and the most obvious trace would be a blood type incompatibility, a genetic marker that cannot fully integrate with the broader human population. A shadow of something older, something that should not exist according to the standard model of human evolution. The scientific community has struggled to explain Rh-negative blood. Some researchers have proposed it is a mutation that arose spontaneously in Europe during the Ice Age, but mutations do not cause immune incompatibility between mother and child. Mutations do not create blood types that the body treats as foreign. The only way this could occur is if Rh-negative blood originated from a separate lineage, a population that was genetically distinct enough that when it interbred with Homo sapiens, the resulting hybrids carried a blood protein that the human immune system did not recognize. The King list describes exactly this scenario. The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. They were advised by the Apkallu beings who were half fish, half human, who came from the Abzu and brought the knowledge of civilization. And at some point during this epoch, according to the Sumerian texts, the gods created a hybrid species, the Lulu, the mixed one, a being with the blood of the gods and the body of a human. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. In 2005, the Human Genome Project announced the discovery of an anomaly in human DNA, chromosome 2. The second largest chromosome in the human genome is the result of a fusion. Two smaller chromosomes, which exist separately in chimpanzees and other primates, were somehow fused together in humans. The fusion point is still visible in the DNA, marked by telomere sequences, the protective caps found at the ends of chromosomes appearing in the middle of chromosome 2. This is not a natural evolutionary process. Chromosomes do not fuse on their own. They require intervention, editing, engineering. The fusion of chromosome 2 is unique to humans. It does not appear in any other primate. It is the single largest genetic difference between humans and chimpanzees, and it occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms. The exact timing is debated, but most estimates place it between 1 and 2 million years ago, long before modern Homo sapiens appeared in the fossil record, long before the Sumerian king list. But the presence of the fusion suggests that human DNA has been modified at some point in our past, deliberately, intentionally, by something or someone with the knowledge and tools to perform chromosomal engineering. The Sumerian texts describe this process with surprising specificity. Enki, the god of the Abzu, takes the clay of the earth, a term that many researchers interpret as a metaphor for genetic material, and mixes it with the blood of a god. The result is a new being, not fully god, not fully human. A hybrid designed to serve a specific function: labor in the mines, cultivation of the fields, construction of temples. The Lulu. If the Lulu were real, if they were the product of genetic engineering performed by the antediluvian administrators, then their descendants would carry genetic markers that do not fit the standard evolutionary model: anomalies, fusions, blood types that cause immune rejection, and those markers would be most concentrated in the populations that lived closest to the original centers of civilization: Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, North Africa, the Basque region. The data matches. Rh-negative blood appears in exactly these populations. Haplogroup X, a rare mitochondrial DNA lineage found in Europe and the Middle East, also appears in isolated Native American populations, suggesting a transatlantic migration that occurred long before Columbus. This haplogroup does not fit the standard Bering Strait migration model. It should not exist in the Americas, yet it does. Concentrated in the Ojibwe and Algonquin tribes of the Great Lakes region, tribes whose oral traditions speak of ancestors who arrived by boat from across the Eastern Sea, fleeing a land that was sinking. The genetic shadow extends beyond blood type. Recent studies of Neanderthal DNA have revealed that modern humans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes, the result of interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. But there are other DNA fragments in the human genome that do not match any known hominin species. Ghost populations, lineages that interbred with Homo sapiens but left no fossils, no bones, no physical evidence beyond their genetic signature embedded in our DNA. One such ghost population has been identified in the DNA of sub-Saharan Africans, another in the DNA of Melanesians and Australian Aboriginals, and a third, unnamed and unidentified, appears in the DNA of European and Middle Eastern populations. The scientific community refers to these as archaic admixtures, unknown ancestors. But the Sumerian texts provide names. The Anunnaki, the gods who came from heaven and the sages who rose from the Abzu. These were not metaphors, they were populations, lineages, species that interbred with humans and then disappeared, leaving behind only their genes and their stories. The king list is not a record of individual rulers. It is a record of a genetic dynasty. A bloodline that lasted for tens of thousands of years because it was biologically distinct. The antediluvian kings were not immortal. They were long-lived because their DNA aged more slowly, repaired itself more efficiently, resisted the degradation that limits human lifespan, and as they interbred with the human population, as their genes mixed with Homo sapiens, the lifespans shortened. The reigns became briefer, the biology diluted, until, by the time of the post-diluvian kings, the average reign was measured in decades, not millennia. This explains the structure of the king list. The antediluvian kings ruled for epochs because they were genetically capable of it. The post-diluvian kings ruled for centuries because they carried only partial amounts of the original genetic material, and the later kings, the ones recorded in historical texts with verifiable reigns of 20 or 30 years, were fully human. The bloodline had been absorbed, integrated. The genetic shadow remained, but the original source was gone. The Rh-negative blood type is the last remnant of that source, a marker in the DNA that says, something different was here, something that does not fully belong to the human evolutionary tree, and it is concentrated in the exact regions where the ancient texts say the gods landed, where the kingship descended from heaven, where the Apkallu emerged from the sea to teach civilization to a species that should not have been ready for it. The immune rejection experienced by Rh-negative mothers carrying Rh-positive children is the body's memory of that difference. The immune system recognizes, on some deep cellular level, that the two blood types are not entirely compatible, that they come from different origins. That one is human, and the other is something else. Something older. Something that was here long before modern humans walked out of Africa and spread across the planet. The scientific community has no explanation for this. Evolution does not produce blood types that attack offspring. Natural selection does not favor traits that reduce reproductive success. Yet Rh-negative blood persists, concentrated in specific populations, resistant to full integration, as if it is being preserved, protected, maintained by some mechanism that operates outside the normal rules of genetics. The king list offers one possible explanation. The antediluvian bloodline was intentionally preserved. The kings did not rule because they were elected or conquered their way to power. They ruled because they were genetically qualified, born into a lineage that had the biological capacity to live for epochs, to track the stars, to oversee a planetary operation that required continuity across tens of thousands of years. And when that lineage began to dilute, when the genetic markers began to fade, the reigns shortened, the system degraded, and eventually, the kingship could no longer function as it had been designed to. The flood accelerated this process. The catastrophe scattered the population. The carefully maintained bloodlines mixed with refugee populations. The genetic purity that had been preserved for epochs was lost in a single generation, and the kings who came after, the post-diluvian rulers, were hybrids, part human, part something else, but no longer capable of the lifespans or the cognitive functions that had defined their ancestors. The Rh-negative blood is what remains, a fragment, a shadow, a genetic echo of beings who lived for tens of thousands of years, who tracked the precession of the equinoxes, who mined gold from the Abzu and built temples aligned with the stars. They are gone now, absorbed into the human population, but their blood remains, flowing through the veins of the Basques, the Kurds, the Berbers. Populations who remember, in their myths and their language and their DNA, that they came from somewhere else, that their ancestors were different, that the gods were real. The blood does not lie, the chromosomes do not lie, and the immune system, attacking its own offspring because it recognizes something foreign, remembers what the history books have forgotten. That humanity is not a single species. We are a hybrid, a mixture of lineages that should never have interbred but did. And the result is a genetic shadow that stretches back to the antediluvian world, to the kings who ruled before the flood, to the moment when something from the Abzu rose to the surface and decided to create a new kind of worker. The Lulu did not die out. They survived. They are us. And the Rh-negative blood, concentrated in the regions where the gods descended, is the proof that the Sumerian king list was never mythology, it was a genetic ledger, a record of bloodlines, not individuals. A map of DNA that stretches back 241,000 years, tracking the slow dilution of a species that once lived for epochs, and now lives for decades. The kings are gone, but their blood remains, circulating, mixing, fading with each generation. Until one day, the shadow will disappear entirely, and the only proof that they ever existed will be the clay tablets pressed in Mesopotamia and the strange blood type that refuses to integrate fully with the rest of humanity. The genetic memory does not forget, and somewhere in the DNA of every Rh-negative individual is a fragment of the antediluvian world, still refusing to be fully human. But the water was not the first catastrophe. In the Libyan desert, stretching across thousands of square miles of sand and rock, there is glass, not small fragments, not scattered shards, entire fields of it. Green, translucent, fused silica that lies in chunks the size of human fists, scattered across the surface like the debris of some ancient explosion. The local Bedouin have known about it for centuries. They call it desert glass, and they avoid the areas where it appears most densely, as if the ground itself is cursed. In 1932, a British surveyor named Patrick Clayton was driving across the desert when his vehicle's tires crunched over something that should not have been there. He stopped, got out, and found himself standing in a field of glass that extended in every direction as far as he could see. The glass was pure, nearly flawless, and it was scattered across the sand in a pattern that suggested it had fallen from above, like rain. Chemical analysis of the glass revealed something impossible. It is composed of nearly pure silicon dioxide, fused at temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius. That is hotter than any natural desert fire, hotter than any volcanic eruption. The only known process that can generate temperatures high enough to fuse sand into glass on this scale is a nuclear explosion or an asteroid impact. And there are no volcanoes in the Libyan desert, no evidence of nuclear weapons, just the glass, lying on the surface, waiting. The distribution pattern is wrong for a meteor impact. If an asteroid had struck the desert, there would be a crater. A central point of impact surrounded by ejecta radiating outward in a circle, but there is no crater. The glass is spread across multiple sites, separated by hundreds of miles, as if the heat source had been atmospheric, as if something had exploded in the sky, raining fire down across the entire region. This glass is not unique to Libya. Similar fields of fused silica have been found in the Sahara, in the Arabian Desert, in the Gobi Desert, in the deserts of Australia and South America. Everywhere the sand is old and undisturbed. There is glass, melted, vitrified, frozen in the moment of its transformation from solid to liquid and back again. The global distribution suggests a global event, something that happened not in one location, but across the entire planet. Something that turned sand into glass in a single, violent instant. The Sumerian texts describe this event. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero witnesses the destruction of the world by fire. The text reads, "The gods were frightened by the deluge, and, shrinking back, they ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. For 6 days and 6 nights the wind blew, torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. When the 7th day dawned, the storm from the south subsided, the sea grew calm, the flood was stilled." The description is specific. The destruction comes from the south. It begins with fire, torrent, and tempest, before the water arrives. And the gods themselves flee, not to the mountains, not to the temples, to the heaven of Anu, to the sky, as if the surface of the earth had become uninhabitable. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not the only text that describes this sequence. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew text, describes stars falling from heaven and setting the earth ablaze. The Hindu Mahabharata describes a weapon called Brahmastra that unleashes fire so intense it turns sand to glass and boils the oceans. The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, describes a rain of fire that destroys the world before the Great Flood. These are not isolated myths. They are consistent descriptions of the same event, recorded by cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The geological evidence supports these accounts. Beneath the surface of the earth, in sediment cores taken from oceans, lakes, and ice sheets, there is a layer of black material. It appears at the same depth in cores taken from every continent. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary layer, or the black mat. It is composed of carbon, soot, and microscopic diamonds nanodiamonds that can only form under extreme pressure and heat, the kind of pressure and heat generated by a massive explosion. The black mat dates to 12,800 years ago, the exact moment when the Younger Dryas Cold Period began, the exact moment when global temperatures plummeted, ice sheets advanced, and sea levels dropped. The exact moment when the antediluvian world, according to the Sumerian king list, was interrupted by catastrophe. But the black mat is not just carbon. It contains other materials: platinum, iridium, rare earth elements that are uncommon in the Earth's crust but abundant in asteroids and comets. The presence of these elements suggests that the explosion was not volcanic. It was extraterrestrial. Something from space struck the atmosphere with enough force to detonate in midair, scattering debris across the entire planet and igniting fires that burned for days. This is called an airburst. When a comet or asteroid enters the atmosphere at high velocity, the friction and compression heat the object to thousands of degrees. If the object is large enough and moving fast enough, it explodes before it hits the ground. The resulting shockwave flattens everything within hundreds of miles. The heat pulse incinerates forests, and the debris, falling back to Earth, ignites secondary fires that spread across continents. The Tunguska event in Siberia, which occurred in 1908, is the most recent example of an airburst. A comet fragment approximately 50 meters in diameter exploded over the remote forests of Russia, flattening 80 million trees across an area of 2,000 square kilometers. There was no crater, no impact site, just a massive explosion in the sky and a scorched landscape that burned for weeks. If a similar event occurred 12,000 years ago, but with a comet fragment 10 or 20 times larger, the devastation would have been planetary. The desert glass is the evidence. The black mat is the evidence. And the sudden drop in global temperatures following the event confirms that something disrupted the climate on a massive scale. The leading theory is that the fires, burning across millions of square miles, released so much soot and ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a decade. The ice sheets, which had been melting, began to advance again. And the coastlines, which had been stable, began to shift as ocean currents changed and weather patterns collapsed. This was the fire that preceded the flood. The Younger Dryas event was not a single catastrophe. It was a cascading collapse, triggered by an airburst that set the world on fire, followed by a nuclear winter that froze the planet, followed by a rapid thaw, when the soot finally settled and the sun returned. The final phase of this collapse was Meltwater Pulse 1b, the moment when the ice sheets destabilized by the initial heating, and the subsequent freeze-thaw cycles collapsed into the ocean and raised sea levels by several meters in a matter of years. The Sumerian king list marks this entire sequence as a single event. Then the flood swept over, but the texts describing the flood consistently mention fire first. The water came after. The sequence is fire, ice, water. And the antediluvian kings, who had presided over a world of stable climate and predictable sea levels for tens of thousands of years, watched as their entire system collapsed in the span of a single generation. The impact was not random. The trajectory, the timing, the devastation, all of it, points to a specific moment in Earth's astronomical cycle. 12,800 years ago, the planet was passing through the debris field of a fragmenting comet. This is not Speculation. Astronomers have identified the source, Comet ENC, a short-period comet that orbits the Sun every 3 years. The comet has been breaking apart for millennia, leaving a trail of debris in its wake. Every year, when Earth passes through this debris field, we experience meteor showers, the torids, small fragments burning up harmlessly in the atmosphere. But 12,000 years ago, the fragments were not small, they were massive, boulder-sized chunks of ice and rock, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, slamming into the atmosphere and detonating with the force of nuclear weapons. The impacts were concentrated in the northern hemisphere, centered over the Laurentide ice sheet that covered North America. The heat from the airbursts melted millions of tons of ice instantaneously. The resulting meltwater flooded into the Atlantic Ocean, disrupting the Gulf Stream and triggering the younger driest cold snap. And the fires, ignited by the heat pulses, spread across the forests and grasslands, turning the sky black with smoke. The desert glass in Libya, in the Sahara in Arabia, is the remnant of these airbursts. The sand, heated to temperatures exceeding volcanic eruptions, fused into glass and fell back to the ground like frozen rain. The fields of glass are not evenly distributed. They cluster in specific patterns, suggesting multiple impact sites. Multiple explosions, a barrage of fire that lasted for hours, perhaps days, as Earth moved through the densest part of the debris field. The Sumerian texts capture the terror of this moment. In the Atreus epic, another flood narrative that predates the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide to destroy humanity because the noise of civilization has become unbearable. But the destruction they unleash is not controlled. The text describes the gods losing control of their own weapon, watching in horror as the fire spreads beyond their intentions. Enki, who had warned the human Atrahasis to build a boat, is described as weeping when he sees the scale of the devastation. The text reads, "The gods were terrified at the deluge. They fled and ascended to the heaven of Anu, crouching like dogs against the outer wall." This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of eyewitness testimony. The gods, the antediluvian administrators, did not cause the catastrophe. They witnessed it, and they were as helpless as the humans they ruled over. The fire came from the sky. It could not be stopped. It could not be controlled. And when it finally ended, when the flames died and the smoke cleared, the world had been transformed. The black matte layer preserves the moment. In sediment cores taken from across North America, the layer is dense with charcoal, soot, and the remains of burned megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all of them extinct within a narrow window of time corresponding to the younger Dryas boundary. The extinction was not gradual, it was sudden, catastrophic, and it coincides exactly with the layer of neodymiums, platinum, and iridium that marks the airburst. The animals did not die from the cold. They died from the fire. The ice age that followed was the consequence, not the cause. And by the time the ice melted, by the time Meltwater Pulse 1b raised the sea levels and flooded the coastlines, the survivors were few, scattered, traumatized. The cities were gone. The infrastructure was gone. The calendar was disrupted. And the kings, who had ruled for epochs, could no longer maintain the system they had built. The glass fields are a monument to that moment. They are not natural formations. They are scars. Evidence of a planetary trauma that reset the clock and forced humanity to begin again. And the fact that the Sumerian king list acknowledges this event, that it divides history into before the flood and after the flood, suggests the scribes understood that the flood was not just water. It was the culmination of a sequence that began with fire. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, sealing his boat with bitumen and waiting as the fire rains down. The text says, "With the first light of dawn, a black cloud came from the horizon. Inside it, Adad thundered, while Shulat and Hanish went in front, moving as heralds over hill and plain. The stillness that came with the approach was like the silence before a storm. Adad is the storm god. Shulat and Hanish are minor deities associated with atmospheric phenomena, but the description is precise. A black cloud, thunder, silence. These are the characteristics of an atmospheric shockwave, the kind generated by an airburst. The stillness before the storm is the moment when the pressure wave arrives, compressing the air, silencing all sound, and then the explosion, the fire, the glass rain. The survivors, the ones who made it through the fire and the ice and the water, carried the memory. They carved it into stone. They pressed it into clay. They encoded it in myths that would be retold for thousands of years, ensuring that future generations would know, the world ended once, it can end again, and the signs will be the same. Fire from the sky, darkness, silence, and then the water. The antediluvian world did not simply fade, it was incinerated. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years watched as their system, their civilization, their carefully calibrated infrastructure was destroyed in a matter of days. The astronomical observatories burned, the mines flooded, the workers scattered, and the bloodline, the genetic dynasty that had maintained continuity for epochs, was diluted by refugees and survivors who had no connection to the old system. The younger Dryas was the reset. The black mat is the boundary line between the old world and the new. And the desert glass, scattered across the planet in fields of frozen fire, is the physical proof that the flood described in the king list was not a myth. It was the final act in a planetary catastrophe that began with a rain of comets and ended with the drowning of every coastal city on Earth. The glass is cold now, silent, but it remembers the heat, the violence, the moment when the sky turned black and the sand turned to liquid and the world, as the antediluvian kings had known it, ceased to exist. The Sumerian texts do not describe the fire in detail, they focus on the water. But the fire is there, hidden in the poetry, buried in the descriptions of gods fleeing to the heavens and storms coming from the south. The scribes knew, they remembered, and they encoded the sequence into their flood narratives, ensuring that anyone who read the texts carefully would understand. The flood was not the beginning, it was the end. The glass lies in the desert, waiting. A testament to the fire that came before the water. A reminder that the antediluvian world did not simply sink beneath the waves. It burned first. And the ashes of that burning are pressed into the black mat, layered into the sediment, frozen into the ice cores, scattered across the deserts in fields of green, translucent glass that should not exist. The kings watched the sky turn to fire. They watched the cities burn. They watched the ice melt and the water rise. And when it was over, when the survivors emerged from their boats and their mountain refuges, they looked at the devastated landscape and understood that the old world was gone. The kingship would have to be lowered from heaven again. The calendar would have to be recalculated. The system would have to be rebuilt from scratch, but they never forgot the fire. They carved it into their myths. They pressed it into their clay tablets, and they left behind the glass, scattered across the desert, as evidence that the fire was real, that the gods were not invincible, that the world can end, that it has ended before, and that it will end again. But the survivors did not forget everything. In the ruins of Nineveh, among the 30,000 tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal, there is a circular clay disc, roughly 5 inches in diameter. It is covered in cuneiform script, arranged in a spiral pattern, radiating outward from the center like the arms of a galaxy. For over a century, the disc sat in the British Museum, catalogued as an administrative record, a grain tax, a boundary marker, something mundane, until 1999, when a researcher named Alan Bond noticed something strange. The markings on the disc were not text, they were coordinates, angular measurements, astronomical observations recorded with a level of precision that should not have been possible for a civilization without telescopes, without sextants, without any of the tools we associate with celestial navigation. Bond brought in a colleague, Mark Hempsel, an aerospace engineer specializing in orbital mechanics. Together, they began to decode the disk. What they found was impossible. The disk is a star map, but not of the night sky as it appears from Earth. It is a map of the sky as it appeared on a specific date, at a specific time, from a specific location. The date, June 29, 3123 BC. The time, pre-dawn. The location, the mountains of Austria. And the event being recorded, an asteroid impact. The disk, now known as the planisphere of Nineveh, is not a record of mythology. It is an impact log, a forensic document created by someone who witnessed an asteroid entering the atmosphere, tracked its trajectory across the sky, calculated its angle of descent, and determined its impact site with enough precision to mark it on a map. The level of mathematical sophistication required to do this is staggering. It requires an understanding of spherical geometry, trigonometry, and the ability to convert observations made from one location into coordinates that would be valid from another location thousands of miles away. The Sumerians should not have been capable of this. They lived 4,000 years before Newton, 5,000 years before Galileo, yet the planisphere proves they were not just watching the sky, they were calculating it, measuring it, recording events with the precision of modern astronomers. And they were doing it not with computers or satellites, but with clay and a stylus, pressing coordinates into wet mud and firing it so the record would survive for millennia. The asteroid recorded on the planisphere was not small. Bond and Hempsel calculated its size based on the trajectory and the atmospheric disruption described in the markings. The object was approximately 1 kilometer in diameter, large enough to generate a shock wave visible from hundreds of miles away, large enough to leave a crater. And when they traced the trajectory to its conclusion, when they identified the impact site marked on the disk, they found something chilling: the Kafels landslide, a massive geological scar in the Austrian Alps, where an entire mountainside collapsed at some point in the distant past, burying the valley below under millions of tons of debris. Geologists have debated the cause of the landslide for decades. Some argue it was seismic, others suggest glacial melt, but no one could explain why the rock at the impact site shows signs of vitrification, melting, fusion, the same kind of heat signature found in the Libyan desert glass. The planisphere explains it. An asteroid struck the mountain at a shallow angle, transferring its kinetic energy into the rock and triggering a catastrophic landslide. The heat from the impact fused the stone. The shock wave flattened the surrounding forests. And somewhere in Mesopotamia, over 2,000 miles away, a Sumerian astronomer recorded the event in such detail that 4,000 years later, engineers could use the coordinates to identify the exact impact site. This level of observational astronomy requires infrastructure, observatories, trained personnel, a system for recording and preserving data across generations, and it requires a reason, a purpose. You do not build a planetary monitoring network unless you are expecting something, unless you know that the sky is dangerous, that objects fall from it, that the fire can come again. The antediluvian kings knew this. They had lived through the Younger Dryas event. They had watched the sky turn to fire. They had seen the comets fragment and the airbursts ignite the atmosphere. And when the survivors rebuilt, when they re-established the kingship in Kish and Uruk and Yor, they did not forget. They built observatories. They trained astronomers. They created a system for tracking every object in the sky, every anomaly, every deviation from the expected pattern, because they understood that the next catastrophe was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The planisphere is proof of this system. It is not an isolated artifact. It is part of a larger network of astronomical records that span thousands of years. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that they could predict its position decades in advance. They recorded eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the precession of the equinoxes, and they encoded all of this data using the Base 60 mathematical system, a framework so efficient that it is still used today in every clock, every compass, every navigational chart. The Base 60 system is not arbitrary, it is astronomical. A circle divides naturally into 60 degrees because 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it ideal for calculating angles, tracking celestial motion, and converting between different units of measurement. If you are building a civilization that depends on accurate timekeeping, on predicting the movements of the stars, on synchronizing rituals and agricultural cycles with celestial events, you need a mathematical system that can handle complex divisions without generating fractions. Base 60 provides that, but the Sumerians did not invent it. They inherited it. The system appears fully formed in the earliest Sumerian texts, with no evidence of gradual development or trial and error. It is there from the beginning, as if it had been handed down from someone who had already perfected it, someone who had been using it for so long that it had become second nature, someone who thought in Base 60 the way we think in Base. The antediluvian kings thought in Base 60. They ruled for epochs, measured in sexagesimal notation. 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Numbers that divide cleanly into 60, into 360, into the great year of 25,920 years. The rains were not random. They were calibrated, synchronized with the precessional cycle, and the Base 60 system was the language of that synchronization. The Dendera zodiac confirms this. In the temple of Hathor at Dendera, Egypt, there is a circular stone carving on the ceiling of a chamber built during the Ptolemaic period, around 50 BC. The carving shows the constellations of the zodiac arranged in a circle, with figures representing the 12 signs surrounding a central axis. At first glance, it appears to be a standard astrological chart. but the positioning of the constellations is wrong. They are not aligned with the sky as it appeared in 50 BC. They are aligned with the sky as it appeared thousands of years earlier. Astronomers who have studied the Denderer zodiac have calculated the date encoded in the carving. The precessional alignment corresponds to approximately 10,500 BC. The exact period when the antediluvian world was collapsing, when the fire came, when the ice melted, when the flood swept over. The Egyptians did not create this zodiac. They copied it. They preserved a star map that had been passed down through generations, maintained in temples, recarved into stone whenever the original began to erode, because the knowledge it contained was too important to lose. The Dendera zodiac is a time capsule, a record of the sky as it appeared during the antediluvian epoch, and the fact that it was still being preserved and copied in 50 BC, over 10,000 years after the original observation, proves that the astronomical knowledge of the antediluvian kings did not die with them. It was transmitted, encoded, hidden in temples and libraries and mathematical systems, waiting for a future civilization to rediscover it. The Sumerian king list serves the same function. It is not a historical record in the conventional sense. It is a chronological anchor, a way of marking epochs, of preserving the memory of deep time, of ensuring that future generations would know that civilization did not begin 5,000 years ago. It began much earlier, and it was interrupted, reset, forced to start over after a catastrophe that destroyed the infrastructure but not the knowledge. The scribes who copied the king list understood this. They preserved the impossible numbers because the numbers were the point. They were proof that someone had been counting, tracking, measuring time across epochs. And the fact that the numbers correspond to astronomical cycles, to the precession of the equinoxes, to the sexagesimal division of the great year, proves that the antediluvian kings were not mythological figures. They were chronological markers, designations for specific eras in a calendar system that spanned hundreds of thousands of years. This is why the king list was copied so many times. Why 16 different versions of it have been found, each one faithfully reproducing the same names, the same cities, the same reign lengths. The scribes were not recording history. They were preserving a calendar, a cosmic clock, a system for tracking the slow rotation of the stars and ensuring that the knowledge of precession, of base 60 mathematics, of astronomical observation would survive even if the civilization that created it did not. The planisphere of Nineveh is part of this system. It records a specific event, an asteroid impact, but it does so using the same mathematical framework, the same sexagesimal notation, the same astronomical precision that defines the king list. The two documents are connected. They are products of the same civilization, the same mindset, the same obsession with tracking the sky and preserving the data for future generations, and the obsession was justified. The planisphere proves that the antediluvian survivors were still monitoring the sky, still watching for the next impact, still recording every anomaly, because they knew the comets would return. The debris field that had caused the Younger Dryas event was not a one-time occurrence. Earth passes through it every year, and every few thousand years, the fragments are large enough to be dangerous, large enough to burn forests, to melt ice sheets, to end civilizations. The antediluvian kings built their astronomical observatories not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They were tracking threats, monitoring the sky for objects that could destroy everything they had built. And when they saw something, when they calculated a trajectory, when they determined that an impact was imminent, they recorded it, preserved the data, ensured that future generations would know that the sky is not benign, that the universe is hostile, that survival depends on constant vigilance. The planisphere is dated to 3123 BC. Over 1,000 years after the flood, the antediluvian system had survived. The observatories were still functioning. The astronomers were still trained in basic STE mathematics. The knowledge had been preserved across the catastrophe, passed down through the post-diluvian kings, maintained in temples and libraries until it could be recorded in clay and fired into permanence. But the system was degrading. The planisphere is one of the last detailed astronomical records from Mesopotamia. After 3000 BC, the records become less precise, less frequent. The infrastructure was collapsing. The trained astronomers were dying out. The knowledge was fragmenting into myth and legend. By the time of the Babylonians, by the time of the Assyrians, the basic STE system was still in use, but the reason for it had been forgotten. They used it to measure grain and count days, not to track the precession of the equinoxes or predict asteroid impacts. The king list became a myth. The planisphere became a curiosity. And the Dendera zodiac became a religious symbol, its astronomical significance buried under layers of interpretation and ritual. The knowledge was still there, preserved in the artifacts, encoded in the mathematics, waiting for someone with the tools and the training to decode it. But the context was lost. The purpose was forgotten. And the antediluvian system, which had tracked the stars for tens of thousands of years, finally went silent. Yet the artifacts remain. The planisphere sits in the British Museum, its coordinates still accurate, its calculations still verifiable. The Dendera zodiac hangs in the Louvre, its precessional alignment still pointing to 10,500 BC. The Sumerian king list, copied and recopied across 16 different tablets, still lists the same impossible reigns, the same astronomical epochs, the same evidence that someone was counting, and the basic STE system, invented or inherited by the antediluvian kings, is still in use today. Every time we check a clock, every time we measure an angle, every time we divide a circle into 360 degrees, we are using their system, their mathematics, their framework for tracking time and space. The antediluvian civilization is not dead. It is embedded in the foundations of everything we do, hidden in plain sight, encoded in the way we measure the world. The Library of the Stars was never a single building. It was a system. A network of observatories, temples, and trained astronomers who spent generations watching the sky, recording the data, and preserving it in a format that could survive fire, flood, and the collapse of empires. The clay tablets were the backup drives. The mathematical system was the operating system. And the king list was the chronological index, marking the epochs, ensuring that anyone who found it would know. Time is deeper than you think. Civilization is older than you remember. And the stars, still turning in their slow eternal rotation, are still being watched by someone. The planisphere is a message, a warning, a reminder that the sky is not empty, that objects fall from it, that the fire can come again. And the only defense is knowledge, observation, the ability to see the threat coming and prepare. The antediluvian kings understood this. They built the system, they maintained it for epochs. And when the fire came, when the ice melted, When the flood swept over, they encoded the knowledge into clay and stone and mathematics, ensuring that future generations would have the tools to rebuild, to remember, to watch the sky. The stars do not forget, the clay does not forget, and the basic sea system, still ticking in every clock on Earth, remembers the civilization that created it. The kings who ruled for epochs, the astronomers who tracked the comets, the scribes who pressed the impossible numbers into wet mud and fired them into eternity. The library of the stars is still open, still transmitting, still waiting for someone to finally understand what the antediluvian kings were trying to tell us. The sky is watching, and we should be watching back. But the knowledge was not the only thing that survived. In the highlands of southeastern Turkey, on a barren ridge overlooking the Harran Plain, there is a place that should not exist. It is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill, a name that reveals nothing about what lies beneath. For thousands of years, local farmers avoided the site. The ground was rocky, difficult to plow, and there were rumors of spirits, of something old and angry buried in the earth. In 1954, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt noticed something unusual about the rocks scattered across the hilltop. They were not natural, they were carved, and when his team began excavating, they uncovered something that should have been impossible. Massive stone pillars, 20 tons each, arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, serpents, scorpions, vultures. The pillars are T-shaped, standing upright like silent sentinels. Their surfaces smooth, despite being buried for over 11,000 years. The site is enormous. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Beneath the surface, there are at least 20 additional stone circles, each one requiring thousands of hours of labor to construct, each one predating the invention of agriculture, the wheel, and written language by several millennia. The official date for Göbekli Tepe is 9600 BC. But this is only the date of Layer 3, the uppermost layer of construction. Beneath it, there are older layers, deeper circles, larger stones, and the deeper you go, the more sophisticated the engineering becomes. This is the opposite of what archaeology expects. Civilizations are supposed to develop gradually, improving their techniques over time. But at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest layers are the most advanced, as if the builders were working from a template they already understood, a design they had perfected long before they arrived at this hilltop in Turkey. The timeline is exact. Göbekli Tepe was constructed during the Younger Dryas period, the exact moment when the antediluvian world was collapsing, when the fire was falling, when the ice was melting, when the Sumerian king list says the flood swept over and the kingship had to be lowered from heaven again. The site is not a temple built by primitive hunter-gatherers. It is a reconstruction, a memorial, a place built by survivors who remembered what had been lost and were trying to rebuild it using the knowledge they carried. The pillars themselves are encoded with information. The animal carvings are not decorative. They are astronomical. Researchers have identified constellations in the arrangement of the figures. The vulture represents Sagittarius. The scorpion represents Scorpio. The fox represents Lupus. The pillars are a star map, carved in stone, showing the night sky as it appeared 11,000 years ago. The same technique used in the Dendera zodiac. The same obsession with preserving celestial knowledge. The same understanding that the stars are not just decorative, they are the calendar. But the most disturbing detail is what happened to Göbekli Tepe after it was built. It was buried, deliberately, intentionally. The stone circles were filled with rubble, covered with dirt, and sealed, not by erosion, not by time, by human hands. Someone decided that the site was too important to leave exposed, too dangerous to allow it to be found by the wrong people, so they buried it, turned it into a hill, a potbelly mound that would blend into the landscape and be forgotten for 11,000 years. This was not destruction. This was preservation. The same impulse that drove the Sumerians to copy the king list 16 times. The same impulse that drove the Egyptians to recarve the Dendera zodiac. The survivors of the antediluvian world understood that knowledge could be lost, that civilizations could fall, that the only way to ensure the information survived was to encode it in stone, bury it, and trust that a future generation would be intelligent enough to dig it up and decode it. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across Turkey, across the Levant, across Mesopotamia, there are thousands of tells, earthen mounds that rise above the flat plains like blisters on skin. Each tell represents a layered settlement, centuries or millennia of habitation compressed into a single mound. Archeologists estimate that there are over 10,000 tells in Iraq alone. Most have never been excavated. Most have never even been surveyed. They sit in the desert, silent and ignored, holding the physical remains of cities that were built, destroyed, rebuilt, and then buried. The tells are time capsules. Each layer represents a different era, a different civilization. And if you dig deep enough, if you excavate down through the Islamic layers, through the Assyrian layers, through the Babylonian layers, through the Sumerian layers, you eventually reach something older, foundations that predate the textbooks, structures built with techniques that should not have been possible, stones cut with a precision that rivals modern tools, and artifact seals, tablets, tools that suggest the people who lived there were not primitive. They were educated, trained, operating according to a system that had been developed long before they arrived. The Iraqi tells are the physical evidence of the antediluvian cities, Eridu, Kish Oruk, Shuruppak. These were not small settlements. They were administrative centers, nodes in a planetary network that stretched from the gold mines of South Africa to the observatories of Turkey. And beneath the visible ruins, beneath the layers that have been excavated, there are older structures, deeper foundations, the physical thrones of the kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, buried, waiting, sealed under millennia of sediment and later construction, protected by the simple fact that no one has the time, the funding, or the political stability to dig them up. The Antikythera mechanism proves that the technology existed. In 1901, divers exploring a shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera recovered a corroded lump of bronze. It sat in storage for decades, dismissed as ship debris. But in 1951, a researcher named Derek de Sala Price began cleaning the object and realized it was not debris. It was a machine, a clockwork device composed of over 30 interlocking gears, each one precisely cut and calibrated, designed to calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and planets over a 19-year cycle. The Antikythera mechanism dates to approximately 100 BC, but the technology it represents is far older. The gears are too sophisticated, too precise. The level of engineering required to design and build such a device does not appear suddenly in the 1st century BC. It requires centuries of accumulated knowledge. Prototypes failed. experiments, refinements. Yet there are no precursors to the Antikythera mechanism in the archaeological record. No earlier versions, no developmental stages. It appears fully formed, as if it had been copied from an older design that no longer exists. The mechanism uses a 60-tooth gear, base 60, the same mathematical system used by the Sumerians, the same system encoded in the king list, in the planisphere, in the Dendera zodiac. The mechanism is not a Greek invention. It is a Greek reconstruction. A copy of a device that was designed thousands of years earlier by a civilization that understood astronomy, mechanics, and the importance of tracking celestial cycles with absolute precision. The mechanism is not alone. There are hints of similar devices scattered across the ancient world, mentioned in texts but never found. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, describes a device built by Archimedes that could predict the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Cicero claims to have seen it with his own eyes, housed in the Temple of Virtue in Rome. But the device has never been recovered. It was lost, destroyed, or buried. Like everything else that survived from the antediluvian world, the tells in Iraq hold the answer. Beneath the surface, beneath the layers of Islamic, Assyrian, and Babylonian occupation, there are structures built by the post-diluvian kings. And beneath those structures, there are older foundations, antediluvian foundations, built by the kings who ruled for epochs, the kings who tracked the stars, who mined the gold, who created the Lulu, who watched the fire fall from the sky and then rebuilt, encoding their knowledge into temples and tablets and mechanical devices that could calculate the heavens. The Iraqi government has conducted limited surveys of the tells using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging. The results are classified, but leaked reports suggest the presence of massive stone structures beneath many of the mounds, structures that do not match the mud-brick architecture of later Mesopotamian civilizations. Structures built from carved stone blocks weighing tens of tons, fitted together with a precision that suggests advanced engineering. The same kind of engineering found at Göbekli Tepe, the same kind of precision found in the Great Pyramid of Egypt. The same kind of craftsmanship that appears suddenly, without precedent, as if it had been inherited rather than invented. But the tells remain unexcavated. The political situation in Iraq has made large-scale archaeology impossible. The tells sit in active war zones, minefields, areas controlled by militias or the remnants of extremist groups, even when the security situation allows. For excavation, the funding is insufficient. The international community is more interested in preserving what has already been found than in discovering what remains buried, and so the tells wait silent, holding the physical proof that the Sumerian king list was not mythology, that the antediluvian kings were real, that their cities still exist, buried under thousands of years of sediment, waiting for someone with the resources and the courage to dig them up. Göbekli Tepe is what happens when you do dig, when you ignore the textbooks and excavate the impossible sites. And the result is always the same. The oldest layers are the most advanced. The deepest structures are the most sophisticated. The earliest carvings are the most detailed. As if the builders were not learning, they were remembering, working from blueprints that had been passed down through generations, trying to recreate something they had seen before, something that existed before the fire, before the ice, before the flood. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BC, 2000 years after it was built, long enough for the survivors to complete the construction. to encode the astronomical data into the pillars, to ensure the knowledge was preserved. And then they covered it, filled the circles with rubble, sealed the site, turned it into a mound that would be invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking for. The same strategy used across Mesopotamia: build, encode, bury. Wait, the tells are not ruins, they are archives. Physical storage devices containing the artifacts, the tools, the architectural evidence of a civilization that operated on a timescale measured in epochs, not generations. And the fact that they remain unexcavated is not an accident. It is a protection mechanism. The knowledge is too important to be left exposed, too dangerous to be accessible to civilizations that are not ready for it. The antediluvian survivors understood this. They buried Göbekli Tepe. They abandoned the cities and let them turn into mounds. They encoded the knowledge and then stepped back, trusting that when the time was right, when humanity was ready, the tells would be excavated and the truth would finally be revealed. But that time has not yet come. The tells remain silent. The stone circles remain buried. And the Antikythera mechanism, the only surviving mechanical device from the antediluvian tradition, sits in a museum case in Athens, corroded and incomplete. A fragment of a technology that once existed across the entire planet but was lost when the fire came and the water rose. The Iraqi tells are not ancient garbage heaps. They are the physical thrones of the kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. The administrative centers of a global network that tracked the stars, mined the gold, and created the hybrid workforce that became humanity. And beneath the surface, beneath the mud and the rubble and the layers of later construction, the evidence waits. Stone foundations, carved pillars, mechanical devices, astronomical instruments. All of it preserved by the simple fact that no one has dug deep enough to find it. The technology was real. Göbekli Tepe proves it. The Antikythera mechanism proves it. The precision of the Great Pyramid proves it. The basics de mathematics proves it. The alignment of temples across the globe proves it. But the physical infrastructure, the cities where the antediluvian kings actually lived, the palaces where they ruled, the observatories where they tracked the starsel of that remains buried, hidden beneath thousands of tells that dot the landscape of Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Iran, waiting for a generation with the tools, the funding, and the willingness to dig past the comfortable narratives and confront the evidence that civilization did not begin 5,000 years ago. It began much earlier, and it was far more advanced than we are willing to admit. The silence is not accidental. The tells do not speak because they are waiting for the right questions, waiting for archaeologists who are not afraid of impossible dates, waiting for a civilization that is ready to accept that the Sumerian king list was accurate, that the antediluvian kings were real, that their cities still exist, buried under the sand, holding the proof that humanity is not the first advanced civilization to inhabit this planet. We are the 7th, or the 8th, or the 10th. And the evidence is right there, beneath the surface, in the silent cities that refused to stay forgotten. Göbekli Tepe was the warning. A single site, excavated by chance, revealing engineering that should not have existed. And if one site can overturn the entire timeline of human civilization, what will happen when the tells are finally excavated? When the deeper layers are exposed? When the stone thrones of the antediluvian kings are finally brought to the surface and the world is forced to confront the fact that the Sumerian scribes were not recording myths, they were recording history, deep history. the kind that stretches back not 5,000 years, but 50,000, or 100,000, or longer. The tells are waiting. The silent cities are holding their breath. And somewhere beneath the Iraqi desert, under layers of mud and time and deliberate burial, the throne of Ululam still stands, carved from stone that does not erode, aligned with stars that have shifted but still remember, waiting for the day when someone finally asks the right question. If the Sumerian king list is historically accurate, where are the cities? Where are the kings? Where is the proof? The proof is in the tells, in the silent cities, in the buried stone circles and the unexcavated mounds that rise like monuments across the cradle of civilization. The cities that should not exist. The engineering that predates the textbooks. The knowledge that was encoded, buried, and sealed, waiting for a future generation intelligent enough to recognize what they are looking at. The silent cities are not silent because they are dead. They are silent because they are listening, waiting for the sound of shovels, waiting for the world to finally be ready for the truth. The wind moves across the sand, constant, eternal, erasing footprints, covering tracks, burying secrets beneath layers of dust that accumulate so slowly they become indistinguishable from time itself. The site of Eridu sits silent in the Iraqi desert, a low mound rising from the flat plain like the grave of something enormous. The first city. The place where kingship descended from heaven. The place where it all began, or where it began again. The evidence does not lie scattered, it converges. The ice cores from Greenland mark the moment when the fire came. The desert glass in Libya marks where the heat turned sand to liquid. The black matte layer marks the boundary between the old world and the new. The Sumerian king list marks the reigns of those who ruled before the catastrophe and those who ruled after. The Rh- blood marks the genetic remnant of a lineage that should not exist. The planisphere marks the moment when survivors were still watching the sky, still tracking the threats. Göbekli Tepe marks the attempt to rebuild, to encode, to preserve. The tells mark the physical locations where the cities still wait beneath the surface. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. The Sumerian king list is not mythology. It is a chronological record of a civilization that operated on a timescale incomprehensible to modern humans. A civilization that tracked the precession of the equinoxes, that mined gold on an industrial scale, that created hybrid workers through genetic engineering, that built astronomical observatories capable of predicting asteroid impacts. A civilization that ruled for epochs, and then ended, violently, suddenly, completely, but it did not end permanently, it reset. The cycle is visible in the geological record. Major catastrophes occur at predictable intervals, tied to Earth's passage through cosmic debris fields, to shifts in the planet's magnetic field, to the slow wobble of the axis that creates the Great Year. Every 25,920 years, the stars return to their original positions. Every 12,000 years, the climate undergoes a violent transition. Ice ages come and go. Sea levels rise and fall. Coastlines shift. And civilizations, built on those coastlines, drown. The antediluvian kings understood this. They were not living in a golden age of eternal stability. They were living in the interval between catastrophes. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that the next catastrophe was coming, so they prepared. They built the observatories. They tracked the sky. They encoded the knowledge into mathematical systems that could survive the collapse of infrastructure. They buried the evidence in stone circles and clay tablets, and tells that would remain intact even if every living person who understood them died. The king list is not a list of individuals. It is a map of the cycle. The antediluvian epoch represents one complete phase of the cycle, from the last reset to the next. The flood marks the transition. The post-diluvian epoch represents the recovery phase, when survivors rebuild using the knowledge they preserved but can no longer fully understand. And eventually, the reigns shorten. The knowledge fragments, the bloodline dilutes. And by the time recorded history begins, by the time we have kings whose reigns can be verified, the connection to the antediluvian world has been severed. The system is running on inherited instructions, copied and recopied, but no longer comprehended. We are living in the recovery phase. The modern world, with its telescopes and satellites and computers, is only now beginning to rediscover what the antediluvian kings already knew, that the sky is dangerous, that the earth is fragile, that civilizations can end, that they have ended before, multiple times, and that the evidence is right there, buried in the ice, pressed into the clay, scattered across the desert in fields of glass that should not exist. The Kish anomaly is the latest clue. In 2025, a team of Iraqi archaeologists conducting routine ground-penetrating radar scans at the site of Kish detected something unusual. A void, a hollow space beneath one of the tells, at a depth far below any known structure. The void is large, approximately 50 meters in diameter, and the radar suggests it is not a natural cave. The walls are too smooth, too regular, as if it were carved or built. The Iraqi Ministry of Antiquities has not authorized excavation. The site is in a politically unstable region. Funding is limited, and the implications of what might be found are too significant to approach without careful preparation. But the data has leaked. Researchers outside Iraq have analyzed the scans, and the consensus is disturbing. The void is a chamber, a sealed room, built at a depth that corresponds to the antediluvian layers, to the time before the flood, to the epoch when the kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. If the chamber is opened, if it contains artifacts, inscriptions, or technology from the antediluvian world, it will rewrite everything. It will confirm that the king list was accurate, that the cities existed, that the knowledge was real, that we are not the first advanced civilization. We are the latest in a series, the 7th, the 8th, the 10th, living in the ruins of those who came before, slowly rediscovering what they already knew, racing against the clock to reach their level of understanding before the next reset arrives, because the cycle has not stopped. Earth is still passing through the Taurid meteor stream. The fragments are still there, orbiting the sun, waiting for the moment when their trajectory intersects with ours. The climate is still warming. The ice sheets are still melting. The magnetic field is still weakening. All of the conditions that triggered the Younger Dryas event are present again. And this time, we are not prepared. We do not have the observatories. We do not have the base 60 computational systems running continuously for each. We do not have the genetic lineage capable of ruling for tens of thousands of years and maintaining continuity across the reset. We have 5,000 years of recorded history. The antediluvian kings had 241,000, and when the fire comes again, when the ice melts and the water rises, our 5,000 years will be compressed into a single layer of sediment, a boundary line, a black mat, and the survivors, if there are any, We'll dig through the ruins and find our cities buried beneath the sand, just as we are now finding theirs. The king list is not a record of the past. It is a warning about the future. A map of the cycle. A reminder that everything we build is temporary. That the earth remembers longer than we do. That the stars are still tracking the same patterns they tracked when Alulim ruled Eridu, and that the kingship will descend from heaven again when the reset is complete, and the survivors emerge from their sanctuaries to start over. The question is not whether the cycle will continue. The question is whether we will remember. The antediluvian kings left us the tools, the basic system, the star maps, the astronomical records, the genetic markers, the buried cities, the clay tablets copied 16 times to ensure they would survive. They did everything they could to preserve the knowledge across the reset, and for 5,000 years, we ignored it. We called it mythology. We dismissed the impossible numbers. We refused to excavate the tells. We let the knowledge sit in museum storage, catalogued as administrative records, never realizing we were looking at the operating manual for planetary survival. But the cycle is patient. It does not care whether we believe in it. The ice will melt. The fire will fall. The water will rise. And when it does, when our cities are drowning and our satellites are falling from the sky, we will finally understand what the Sumerian scribes were trying to tell us. This has happened before. It will happen again. And the only way to survive is to preserve the knowledge, to encode it, to bury it, to trust that the next civilization will be intelligent enough to dig it up and learn from our mistakes. The Kish chamber might contain that knowledge. It might hold the missing pieces, the complete star charts, the astronomical predictions, the genetic formulas, the technological blueprints, everything the antediluvian kings preserved before the flood swept over. Or it might be empty, a decoy, a test. A way of ensuring that only a civilization advanced enough to excavate a 50-meter deep chamber would have access to the information inside. Either way, the chamber is there. The radar does not lie. And the fact that it sits at the antediluvian depth, beneath layers of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Islamic occupation, suggests it was sealed deliberately, protected, hidden, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to open it and confront the truth. We are not the beginning, we are the middle, and the kings who ruled before us understood the cycle better than we ever will. The signals emerging from the deep desert are another clue. In 2024, seismologists monitoring tectonic activity in the Arabian Peninsula detected low-frequency vibrations coming from beneath the sand. The vibrations are not natural. They pulse at regular intervals, a pattern, a rhythm, and they originate from a depth of approximately 3 kilometers, far deeper than any known archeological site, far deeper than any human construction should exist. The Saudi government has classified the data. The location is restricted. No excavation permits have been issued. But the vibrations continue, pulsing, waiting, as if something beneath the sand is still operational, still running, still transmitting on a frequency we are only now learning to detect. I am currently tracking new intelligence on the Kish chamber and analyzing the seismic data from the Arabian signals. The evidence suggests these sites are connected, part of a larger network that operated during the antediluvian epoch and may still be partially functional. This investigation is ongoing, and the findings will be dangerous, controversial, and potentially war. To ensure you are there when this story breaks, when the chamber is opened or the signals are decoded, You need to be subscribed. The next phase of this investigation will determine whether the antediluvian kings left us a message, a warning, or a key to surviving the next reset. But back in the desert, the wind continues. The sand shifts, the tells wait, and somewhere beneath Eridu, beneath the first city, beneath the place where kingship descended from heaven, the stone feet of the statues still stand, silent, patient, watching as they have watched for 241,000 years, as they will continue to watch long after we are gone. The Sumerian king list is not the end of the story. It is the prologue, a reminder that time is deeper than we imagine, that civilizations rise and fall in cycles measured not in centuries but in epochs, that the stars do not forget, that the ice remembers, that the glass in the desert holds the memory of fire, and that the kings, whoever they were, whatever they were, understood this cycle better than we do. The question is not whether the kings were real. The evidence proves they were real. The question is, when are they coming back? The cycle suggests the answer. Every 25,920 years, the stars return to their original alignment. Every 12,000 years, the climate resets. The last reset was 11,500 years ago. We are approaching the midpoint, the halfway mark, the moment when the debris field is densest, when the magnetic field is weakest, when the ice sheets are most unstable, the moment when the fire could fall again. And if it does, if the sky turns black and the sand turns to glass and the water rises to swallow the coastlines, will we be ready? Will we have encoded the knowledge? Will we have buried the evidence? Will we have done what the antediluvian kings did, ensuring that the next civilization will not have to start from zero? Or will we be like the thousands of civilizations that came before us, the ones that left no trace, no records, no clay tablets, no stone circles, just a thin layer of carbon in the geological record, a black mat marking the moment when the fire came and the reset began? The antediluvian kings gave us a choice. They left the instructions, the mathematics, the star maps, the genetic markers, the buried cities. All we have to do is dig, to decode, to remember, to accept that we are not the first, that we are not the pinnacle, that we are standing on the shoulders of giants who ruled for epochs and watched the world end and rebuilt it anyway because they understood that the cycle is eternal and the only way to survive is to preserve the knowledge across the resets. The wind moves across Eridu, the stone feet stand silent, the stars turn in their slow eternal rotation, and somewhere beneath the sand, in a sealed chamber 3 kilometers deep, something is still pulsing, still waiting, still transmitting a signal that only a civilization advanced enough to detect it would ever hear. The kings are not coming back. They never left. They are buried, encoded, waiting in the tells, in the tablets, in the glass, in the blood, waiting for us to finally understand what they were trying to tell us. That the cycle is real, that the fire will come again, and that the only way to survive is to remember. The question is not whether the Sumerian king list is historically accurate. The question is whether we are ready for the answer. Whether we are ready to dig up the silent cities and confront the evidence that we are not the beginning of history. We are the latest chapter in a story that has been running for hundreds of thousands of years. A story written in ice and stone and blood. A story that the antediluvian kings encoded into every mathematical system, every astronomical record, every clay tablet they left behind. The story is not over. The cycle continues. And the next reset is coming. The only question is, will we remember this time? The lantern flickers one last time, the shadows retreat, and the stone feet, standing in their silent semicircle deep beneath the Mesopotamian silt, cast no judgment. They simply wait, as they have always waited, as they will always wait, for the next civilization, for the next reset, for the moment when someone finally asks the right question and digs deep enough to find the answer. The Sumerian king list is not a myth, it is a map. And the journey it describes is not finished. It has only just begun.